A very warm welcome to my webinar today on the topic of EMDR therapy for anxiety and phobias. I'd just like to start just with a brief introduction to myself. And before I do, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which all of us are watching this webinar, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. For those who don't know me, my name is Caroline Burrows. I'm based in Melbourne in Australia, and I am an EMDR Association of Australia accredited trainer and consultant. My background is in social work and psychotherapy. I've been working in the clinical field for about 15 years now. The last decade of which has been very much focused on EMDR therapy. It's something that I have an incredible love and passion for. I'm the director of a group private practice here in Melbourne called Mindful Living Counselling and Psychology, where I lead a team of marvellous EMDR therapists. Just a few little housekeeping matters. I'd be most grateful if you could please keep your audio muted just while I'm presenting. There will be many opportunities where I will invite you to unmute yourself, because I do like this to be an interactive experience. It is helpful though to avoid interference with the sound for us to remain muted otherwise. There will be opportunity where I will invite you to raise your hand, as it were. So there's actually a little feature that I'll show you in a moment that you can use in Zoom to do that. And I would really encourage you to type things in the chat box at any point throughout the training so that you're able to other. I'll just ask you to mute yourself, please, if you haven't done so already. Thank you. If you're sharing any of your clinical cases or questions during the training, I just invite you please to de-identify client information just to protect our client confidentiality, just so that everybody is aware this webinar is being recorded, and you will all receive a link to this recording, and you will have lifetime access. So you'll be able to rewatch the training as often as you like in the future to reiterate the learnings that you take from today. As we mentioned before, the lovely Jay is here to assist with any technological issues that you encounter. If you do have any difficulties, then please do pop those in the chat box. You are most welcome to call that mobile phone number on the screen there. I wasn't expecting international participants today. I'm absolutely chuffed and delighted that you're here. So for those who are international, the country code is +61, and then you drop the 0 on that phone number that you can see there.
Looks like we need to update the slides for going international.
which is not a bad thing. I'm humbled and delighted to have a wider audience this time. So for those who are not familiar with Zoom, which may not be many of us, given a lot of us have been doing a lot of work and meetings via Zoom in the last 18 months, but if you're unfamiliar with how the technology works, there are two ways that you can interact. So you'll see there that there's a little chat box, which is the little speech bubble. You can click on that and just type anything into that at any point during the training. If you'd like to communicate with me, with Jay, with others, if you have questions, please pop them in there and I will get to them as soon as I'm able to. At various points, I will also invite some verbal interaction as well. And so at that time, what I'd invite you to do is to use the raise hand little function, which you'll see is under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen there. And Jay's just raised his hand so that you can see what that looks like. If you can happen to see his little picture, he's got a little hand next to his face, and then unmute yourself and then speak from there. So without further ado, let's get into things. So with respect to the agenda for today, the topic is EMDR therapy for anxiety and phobias. We're going to be talking about a range of different things. I always like to just start with a general introduction to the topic, and then really to talk a bit about the link between anxiety and phobias and EMDR therapy. So why would this be a relevant therapy for this particular client population? And then to start to talk a bit about how we can apply EMDR therapy to clients that have anxiety and phobias. And that will be many of our clients, as I'm sure you experience. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking on talking about 2 case conceptualization methods to assist us with target selection, because that's one of the biggest questions that comes up, is if someone doesn't have a single incident of trauma, or indeed big T traumas, where do you start? So giving us a bit of an idea about that, I hope, will be helpful. We're then going to start to talk through a number of particular procedures and protocols that largely are based on the standard protocol, but do have a lot of useful ideas to offer us. I'd also like us to really give consideration to how we can work across the 3 prongs of EMDR therapy, and how we can integrate EMDR therapy with other therapeutic modalities. And just a reminder that we will have 2 90-minute parts to this webinar with a 30-minute break in between. At the 30-minute break point, we will actually close the meeting, and then we will reopen the meeting after 30 minutes using the exact same Zoom link that you joined this meeting with. So it's the same meeting link for both parts of the webinar. So with regards to some introductory thoughts, I've been reflecting a lot on EMDR therapy of late, and how a common question that comes up for me in my training and consultancy work is people often feeling when they first train that they struggle to know how to apply EMDR therapy to clients beyond, I suppose, the more PTSD style presentation, where there are clear targets that are highly intrusive or distressing, or the focus of flashbacks or nightmares. And the reality is that this applies to so many of our clients. We have many clients, or at least I have over the years, who may not have big T traumas, in inverted commas, but may have had more trauma by omission. So the experience of neglect, or a lack of validation, or a lack of acknowledgement of their needs. All those smaller T experiences or traumas that occur, or what I'd call adverse life experiences. I think that's a phrase that the ACE questionnaire, the Adverse Childhood Experiences questionnaire, really helped us to get our head around. I think that this is such a relevant point, is that EMDR therapy is not just for trauma. It is for adverse experiences. And I think, therefore, it can be much more widely applied across our clinical caseloads than we might initially think. And I just see that as such a cause for celebration, because EMDR therapy is powerful, and it's transformative, and it's a gift that we can give to our clients, and indeed that we personally, no doubt, can benefit from in many cases as well. So just to get us started, I thought we'd have a little bit of a quiz just to get the ball rolling, but also to get you using the chat box. So I'd invite you to get the little chat box open if you haven't already. So just to click on the little speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. And I'm just going to share with you some words that describe phobias. And I'd love you to pop in the chat box what phobia you think it refers to. So we'll start pretty, I would hope, a little easier, one that most people might know, not everybody, but there you go. Oh, look at that, spiders. I'm getting terrified just seeing the word. I happen to suffer from this phobia. You are indeed, Kate Potter said masks. You're indeed correct, fear of spiders. What about, I think it's cynophobia. Correct me if I get any of the pronunciation wrong. Lisa says dogs. Michelle, dogs. Clowns. Ooh, so a few different ideas here. And it's all good, Kate, by the way. Huntsman. Movies. Oh, claustrophobia. I'm actually having to double check this one myself. I'll give you guys a hint. I definitely don't suffer from this one. In fact, this thing that some people are scared of is my favorite thing in the entire world. Dogs. So I certainly do not suffer from this particular phobia. Isn't it interesting? There's obviously a few of us that are not as familiar with some of this language. And in actual fact, I really had to study up. Deaf dog, says Jess. I think that would be indeed a phobia of mine. Hemophobia. What do you think this one is? Blood. Yep, that's an easier one for some of us. Anyone want to hazard a different guess? Indeed, a fear of blood. What about this one here? Insects? Vomit? Emotions? Indeed, a fear of vomiting. Yes, that's not an unusual one. Glossophobia. Anyone want to hazard a guess for this one? I've got to check my notes for this one. Fear of glossy mags. I'll give you a hint for this one. If I was suffering from this phobia right now, I'd be cowering in the corner right now. fear of public speaking. There you go. A lot of people suffer from that. Miser or misophobia. Not quite sure how to pronounce this one. Anyone want to hazard a guess? Women. Interesting. Chewing noises. Do you know, Olivia, because of misophonia, misophonia, my apologies, which is indeed what you're referring to. I thought that's what this one was too, but it's actually not. That's misophonia. Very, very hard to get our head around these different words. Ben says dirt. Ben's on the right tracks, as says Barbara. So fear of germs. Yep. And two more. Acrophobia. Heights, says Michelle. Flying. Acrobatics. You're on the right track. Fear of heights, flying, acrobatics, heights. And then the last one, trypanophobia. Anyone want to hazard a guess? This one's probably quite topical for some people at the moment. Lisa says needles. Trying too hard. Indeed, fear of needles. Thank you, Lisa. Well, there you go. I hope you learned a few things today. If nothing else, you've learned a phobia or two. So as we move on to talk a bit more about the topic at hand, I just wanted to really start by acknowledging that anxiety is normal. And I'd like to give a big shout out to somebody very special who's in the audience today, who I worked with in an ACT program, who I know also shares my love of the ACT model. ACT, I think, is a really lovely therapeutic model that reminds us of how emotions are, in fact, necessary and healthy, and that trying to get rid of those emotions can cause us some difficulties. So I really just wanted to, I suppose, start by just acknowledging that we need anxiety. Anxiety is necessary for peak performance. Anxiety is a signal to us. We need to trust our gut. We need to trust our intuition when we're not safe. And so it's important for us to recognize that anxiety in and of itself is not the enemy. And for our clients to recognize that anxiety is indeed a natural and a necessary emotion. However, obviously for some of us, anxiety can become incapacitating. It can become disproportionate to the threat that is in our life, and it can become extremely debilitating for us. And so for people that have experienced anxiety disorders, the frequency and the severity that they experience anxiety causes them significant distress and also impairment in daily life. And one of the common hallmarks is avoidance of situations that creates anxiety, which unfortunately, as we know, perhaps in our own lives or with our clients, can create a vicious cycle. The more we avoid, the more we fear, and the more we avoid, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to different anxiety disorders, they will have different symptoms. They will look different, but there does tend to be something in common, which is considered to be irrational, excessive fear and dread, which of course can be extremely distressing for folk. Anxiety disorders are incredibly common, and I have absolutely no doubt that those of us that are participating today either will have clients with anxiety, a loved one with anxiety, or indeed anxiety ourselves. It's a very, very common condition that many, many people experience. So this isn't an exhaustive list, but I did just want to make mention of a number of the anxiety disorders in the DSM-5 that I think are ones that we commonly see in our clinical practice and that will be relevant for our conversation today. So I've obviously mentioned phobia before. We're going to talk a bit later about social anxiety disorder or social phobia, a panic disorder, GAD or generalized anxiety disorder, and agoraphobia, which often does go hand in hand with panic disorder. I was quite interested when I was reviewing the DSM-5 that illness anxiety disorder, previously referred to as hypochondria, is actually not considered an anxiety disorder. It fits under somatic symptom and related disorders. And interesting also OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorders, which does obsessive compulsive disorder, which does have some similarities to things like GAD, is also not considered to be an anxiety disorder, but instead an obsessive compulsive and related disorder. So interesting to see how the DSM-5 has categorized some of these things. So as we start to think about EMDR therapy, I think it's really important to always come back to the basic foundational principles, which is the AIP model, and to really then conceptualize how anxiety disorders are relevant to EMDR therapy or vice versa. So the AIP model is something that we all may think we know, but actually when I do talk to EMDR therapists, sometimes it becomes clear that there can be a little bit of challenge around how to really get our head around this in a clear way and how to explain it to our clients. So essentially the AIP model stems or posits that we have an innate natural healing capacity. So our brains are wired toward healing, just like the body is. And I think that's such a fabulous place to start, because it really commences from that place of we are not broken, we are not unable to recover and heal from adversity. Quite the opposite, we have an innate drive toward adaptive resolution. However, when we experience something traumatic or indeed something adverse or distressing or an accumulation of lots of those experiences, that natural healing capacity in the brain can get overwhelmed and it can get interrupted. And the AIP model suggests that as a result of that, those experiences get, if you like, locked away or don't get processed adequately by the brain and are isolated in a network away from other more adaptive experiences from our life that are held in other networks in our brain. And so as a result, this can have significant impact on a person. And one of the resulting impacts can be anxiety and phobias. So why would we treat anxiety with EMDR therapy, particularly because EMDR therapy was developed for PTSD? Well, I think many of us would agree that anxiety and panic and phobias often do stem from experiences of trauma, or certainly from adverse life experiences. And for those who have experienced panic attacks, I think a lot would agree that the attacks themselves can be perceived as life-threatening. A person can genuinely feel that they are dying, or the experience of having the panic attack can be so frightening that the person has intrusions and even flashbacks of the experience that are not that dissimilar to PTSD. And just from a practical perspective, while there are, of course, evidence-based models for anxiety disorders, cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy approaches being one of them, there are some logistical challenges that can come, I suppose, when treating these sorts of things. So some phobias can be difficult to treat through in vivo exposure. So we're actually re-experiencing and repeatedly approaching the situation that is feared. So things like medical procedures or flying in an aeroplane, I mean, these are things where exposure therapy can be quite logistically challenging. Of course, there are places and therapists that do offer these services, flight simulators and that sort of thing, for example. But I guess EMDR therapy does offer an alternative that can be very effective. And I guess the other question that comes up, I suppose, is how well tolerated is certain treatments for anxiety and phobias. I think graded exposure is certainly more well tolerated, but prolonged exposure, some would argue, is not as well tolerated by clients, and there might be a higher dropout rate due to flooding or overwhelm. And so I guess the idea is that EMDR therapy is offering an alternative that's not a substitute for other evidence-based therapies, but is another way that we might want to consider treating these conditions. Well, it's interesting, though, to note that there isn't a lot of research yet that really endorses EMDR therapy for anxiety and phobias. There's a real need for further research in this area. So I think it's important to note that there does seem to be a bit of a disparity between anecdotal feedback, from numerous trainers and consultants across the world who are finding that this approach works extremely well for anxiety and phobias. A bit of a disconnect between those anecdotal reports and really rigorous randomized controlled trials. So we've got a number that do support EMDR therapy for panic and for specific phobias, but we don't have enough research really to demonstrate with certainty that there is an evidence-based yet for other anxiety disorders. I think particularly those like generalized anxiety disorder or really severe social phobia, social anxiety and that sort of thing, where there tends to be more of a temperamental aspect or a strong negative core belief that might be underpinning those. Those haven't yet been researched quite as extensively as we will need. So if anybody is out there interested in conducting some research, then this is an area where there is some gap. I don't expect that it'll be long before we see further research in these areas. So let's think a little bit now about phase 1 in EMDR therapy. Phase 1 being history taking, rapport building, but particularly memory mapping and target selections. So really getting the lay of the land and working out where we might start when we're treating anxiety disorders and phobias with EMDR. I do a lot of consultation work with EMDR therapists, and these are some really, really common questions that come up. I think the top one there, where to start, is probably the most common question that comes up. So when a client comes in with a single incident of trauma, like a car accident, most of us would do take a history, do some preparation, and then get going really with setting up that target and desensitizing it. But for many clients, even clients who don't have complex trauma, for those who have anxiety disorders, for example, there may be lots of different places that we could possibly start, and it may be difficult to know what to target is a common question as well, around where to start, not just in terms of targets, but with respect to if a client has lots of issues that they're bringing to therapy. Anxiety may be one of them. Where do you start in terms of the presenting concerns, but also there might be other stressors in the client's life. There might be environmental issues. It can be difficult to know sort of in terms of what issues in the client's life to start with. But then once we've identified that, which targets to commence with, that's the second question that often comes up. And then people often do query, well, how much do we need to be stabilizing clients before they get going with the reprocessing aspects of EMDR therapy? One of my real passions as a consultant and a trainer is empowering therapists. A lot of people come to seek consultation after completing their basic training, and my observation is that there can often be some anxiety, ironically, and some nervousness about getting it right, getting it perfect, and getting the right memory, the touchstone memory. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should be haphazard or that we should be, thoughtless in the way that we approach our case conceptualization. Quite the contrary, I'm going to share lots of ideas with you today. But I do want to just say, I think it's really important to not overthink this to the extent that we postpone EMDR desensitization unnecessarily for clients just because we are so anxious about getting it right. And I think a lot of people feel like if they start with the wrong target, so to speak, that something terrible is going to happen. And I guess I just want to really encourage you to trust the process, and that the principles that we're going to talk about today, I do hope will give you more confidence to make intelligent choices, but ultimately to trust that, as we shared before with the adaptive information processing model, that the brain has an innate capacity toward healing. The brain is geared toward adaptive resolution. And so even if we don't start at the most logical place, the brain will find its way there in most cases, or if not, that we will be able to, with support and consultation and collaboratively with the client, we'll be able to get there. So be very gentle with yourself. One of my phrases that I like to use is principles, not prescriptions. So what I mean by that is that the standard protocol is important and fidelity to the protocol is important, but there will be occasions where we do need to intelligently modify the standard protocol to meet the unique needs of particular clients. And I think that guiding principles are much more empowering for us as therapists rather than rigidity to rules in such a manner that we end up in some cases not using it at all. I've regrettably had people that I've consulted with that have actually not even ended up using EMDR therapy at all after their training because they just ended up feeling so de-skilled and unsettled by the whole thing. I just wanted to invite anybody, if you do have any comments, questions or reflections on any of this at any point, don't hesitate to pop them in the chat box as we're going along. So in terms of principles and just guiding ideas, I think for me, what's most important is to really be thinking about ultimately what is most relevant for the client. So you can have all sorts of different ways that you can target. And even today, I'm going to talk you through a number of different protocols and different targeting ideas. But ultimately, I think what we can see here on the screen and the screen to come is really what I'd encourage you to come back to if you're unsure. I'd always start by thinking, what is this client needing from therapy? What are they coming into therapy for and why now? And of those issues, what is most important and what is the top priority to address in therapy? And then following on from that, what's the link between that issue that's really important to address and experiences in their life? Now, that might seem really simple, but I think sometimes just bedding it down to the most simple principles actually is helpful. So this is what's going to provide direction for our treatment. And another guiding principle in the spirit of what's most relevant is that EMDR treatment, in my opinion, should be directed toward finding memories or experiences in the client's life that have a meaningful relationship with their presenting symptoms. And in the same breath, those memories need to also hold some emotional charge in the present. So I think they're the two things to be thinking about is, firstly, is this memory or this experience that we're thinking about targeting, is it meaningfully connected, as in, does it seem to have a link in terms of the negative cognition or the content or the affect? In some way, is it meaningfully linked to the presenting problem we're addressing? And secondly, does it still hold affective resonance in the present? I think sometimes people can feel like they map so many memories in a client's history and feel like they almost have to just target every single one of them really just because they're on a map, or they do a top 10 list and they feel like they have to do all of them. But in some cases, some of those memories may not actually feel like they've got a really clear relevance or link to the presenting concern, or they may not be emotionally charged in the present. Now, I will say that sometimes a memory may not always seem to be emotionally charged, but it may need to be addressed, and that may be because of the presence of protector parts or because of suppression or indeed repression over the course of a client's life. So I'm not suggesting that the client needs to be highly activated by every single memory all of the time in their life to target it. But when we come to target it, we do need to be able to activate it in order to be able to meaningfully address it. And I think this idea of finding the meaningful connection between the current symptoms or issues in the client's life that they're wanting to address and the instances in their life previous that are relevant, I think that the benefit really of that is that clients are likely to feel very motivated to do that treatment. I've had some clients query in EMDR therapy with me need to go back and deal with my past childhood experiences. That doesn't feel relevant. I can hear just a little bit of interference. Can I ask you just to mute yourself, please, if you haven't already?
Yeah, we just took care of that. Sorry about that, Carol.
Not a problem. I think some people, feel as though there's not a clear sense of link. And I think at the very least, if we are addressing early experiences that may not feel as motivating for the client at the outset, we need to provide a rationale for that, like the fact that touchstone experiences or early events are essentially the root issue. If you think back to the AIP model, providing some helpful, clear explanation of that can be very useful. So when it comes to anxiety, I think it's useful to use the phrase adverse experiences or painful life events or stressful experiences, not simply just trauma, because some clients that have anxiety may actually not think that they have trauma, or they may not want to acknowledge that, or they may indeed not have had criterion A, traumatic life events as per the DSM-5. So what I'd love you to do is to pop in the chat box now, or indeed if you would like to speak, you can certainly raise your hand as well. Just pop in the chat box. Are there any experiences that your clients have had that come to mind for you that may not be the big T traumas, but you feel upon having treated these clients may have contributed to the onset and the development of their anxiety or phobia? See lots of great things coming up there. Parents fighting each other about having children while the client was a child, felt a burden to her parents. Thank you, that's a great one. Parent with alcohol issues, bullying. A couple of people have said bullying, criticism, imprisonment of a parent. That's a really interesting one. Feeling left out of peer groups, indeed, Honey, thank you. Pain, being told don't be scared as a response to feeling shared. Thanks, Jess. Attachment, yeah, indeed. Parents fighting in general, friendship issues, rejection, feeling rejected, the client's mother turning attention away at a critical moment when the child needed her. Thanks, Stephanie, indeed. Health issues, illness, yeah, there's some common themes, aren't there? Pandemics, yeah, it's so topical at the moment, isn't it? Yeah. Parental expectations, thanks, Nicholas. Financial issues, cultural beliefs about being female. Thanks, Annie, that's a really interesting one. Fear of rejection. Well, it didn't take long for you guys to come up with a few examples. So this is the sort of thing that we might be considering, as well as, of course, the bigger T traumas for our clients when we're working with EMDR therapy and anxiety. So I'd like to just mention at this point something that we all know, but I think actually gets neglected actually in a lot of trainings, is that EMDR therapy is a three-pronged approach: past, present, and future. And that really interests and excites me actually, because I think it gives us a whole scope of different areas that we can support and empower our clients with EMDR therapy. Not unsurprisingly, people think of the past prong in EMDR therapy. They think of targeting past maladaptively stored, isolated memories. And indeed, that's what we do a lot of the time in EMDR therapy. But Francine Shapiro was so clear that we are not doing a thorough full treatment in EMDR unless we also check for any residual present triggers remaining, and indeed future concerns, and also install what we call the future templates, so helping the client to live differently. So I just really want to put that out there, and I will talk more about this today, is that if you in your EMDR therapy are finding that you're tending to work sort of more essentially in the past prong, I'd really encourage you to be thinking from today about how you can start to really open up your treatment with your clients. This is really important. It's about ensuring the longevity of treatment outcomes, reducing the likelihood of relapse, and also just really helping clients to actually live differently in their life. Often if we target past events, there'll be a natural benefit to their present triggers and their future hopes, of course, and indeed we don't often have to do a lot in the present and the future prong for all clients, but certainly as we talk about today, you'll see that there are often cases where we certainly do need to, and there will be occasions where we may start in any of these three prongs. Typically we start in the past prong, for the reasons I shared before with the AIP model, that the past experiences are considered in EMDR therapy to be the root underpinning of our presenting concerns, but there will be times, as I'll discuss later, where we would start somewhere else. So I hope no one's phobic of dogs. There's a dog on the screen right now. I just invite you just to have a little stretch. I think it's important that we break up the time. Have a drink of water if you need one. And keep the comments coming in the chat box, of course, as well. Okay, let's start to talk now about case conceptualization. Thinking about anxiety disorders and phobias from the AIP model perspective. So I just want to share why I've had this little picture on the slides a number of times, that I see the AIP model as the foundational roots of the work. So come back to this if you feel like this is at any time in your work, you feel like you lose your way, come back to those foundational principles. So from the AIP model perspective, the basic assumption is that anxiety symptoms do have their own dynamic and developmental history. They didn't just develop out of nowhere. I do want to acknowledge, of course, that anxiety will often have a genetic component, a temperamental component. There'll be lots of factors that contribute to the development of an anxiety disorder. And indeed, I think the AIP model may fail to mention that at times. So I want to acknowledge that. But from the AIP model perspective, what we're really looking at is the ways in which the anxiety and the phobia have developed as a consequence of experiences that the person has had in their life. And the idea from the AIP model perspective is that addressing these relevant issues or memories is likely to lead to symptom reduction or resolution. So what I'm going to share with you in some detail now is a two-method approach that Ad de Jong and his colleagues have developed. And I want to say that since the development of this particular concept of the two-method approach, Ad de Jong's gone on to actually train in case conceptualization around a range of different target paths, case conceptualization paths. But for today's purposes, I thought these two were the ones that were most relevant for us to explore together. So there's two approaches that Ad de Jong and colleagues suggest are really helpful for conceptualizing and sequencing target selection when we are using EMDR therapy to approach anxiety disorders. Firstly, starting from the current symptoms and then working our way back to identifying targets on a timeline. That's the first method that I'm going to talk about. And the second is coming at it from a different perspective, is coming at it really from a core underlying belief, and then finding memories that relate to that so-called prove to the person, quote unquote, that they are indeed what they believe they are, their negative core belief. So let's talk about them one at a time. The first method is otherwise known as the timeline method. And before I do get into talking about these, I'd just like to share that I have emailed you an article that is going to provide some further information about this. So I do hope that that's helpful for you. So this timeline method is particularly useful for anxiety disorders or phobias where there are quite evident experiences. They don't have to be big T traumas, but quite tangible experiences that the person has had in their life that can be quite meaningfully mapped over a timeline and therefore identified as targets. So clear, obvious targets, things like a person who has, say, a dog phobia and has had some experiences along the way where they might have, as we'll see in the example that I'll present, might have had some adverse experiences. Or it may be a person who has panic disorder, and the panic attacks in certain places and times are quite clear experiences that have been highly distressing. So what we do in this method, so this is just to be clear about conceptualizing the problem, but also setting up a target sequence. So discerning what we're going to target in EMDR therapy. So in this first method, also known as the timeline method, what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to go from symptoms to targets. We start by identifying, well, what are the client's current symptoms? There might be clusters of them. and which of those need to be addressed first. So I want to really acknowledge, I know it's not simple in clinical practice. You may have a client who has a sense of not being safe in the world. You may have, they may have low self-worth. They may have trust issues. There may be a range of difficulties, but I do think that it does make a lot of difference in terms of the simplicity in EMDR therapy and just feeling like we've got a handle on what we're doing and a clear plan to identify a good starting point if possible. So of those issues, what's one that is likely to be a tangible and an appropriate place to begin? And generally that's guided by the issue that is most distressing and most impairing for the client. So once we've identified which symptom or cluster of symptoms is the best place to start, what we then want to do is identify which event or the event around that time seems to be linked to the onset of the symptoms. And then from there, what events seem to have exacerbated it over the course of time. And there's a number of questions that can assist us to support a client to discern what this might be. So we might ask a client, when did these symptoms first start, or when did you first feel this way? When did your fear of needles first begin? What events in your life do you think have actually made it worse? Has it waxed and waned? Has it been constant? Has it been dormant for many years and then spiked? If so, what happened around this time? And then what we want to do is, in this particular method, is we want to outline on a graph. It's not as complex as it sounds. I'm terrible at maths, so believe me, simple is best. A graph that helps us to see along the x-axis, time, and along the y-axis, severity, and essentially just mapping each of these experiences and how they relate to the fear onset and the life of the fear over time. So another dog phobia example that seems to be quite topical today. So this is a simple example, and I do want to acknowledge, of course, many of our clients are more complex than this, which is why the second method may be more appropriate for some clients. But if you've got a client who has a simple phobia or an anxiety disorder that's quite easily mapped out, you may find that doing a graph like this is a really helpful way to map targets. So what you can see here is you've got age along the bottom, so time from birth through to their current age, and then along this axis here we've got severity of the fear, 0 to 10. And then the idea is that you ask the client, as I mentioned before, when did the fear start? So this person might say, for argument's sake, that it's hard to say exactly based on this graph, but let's just say at about age 8 they were bitten by a dog, and that's when their fear started. So we pop that there. We then might ask them along the way, have there been other experiences where the fear has worsened? Has it been the same? Has it waxed, waned, as I said before? And the client might identify that more or less it peaked when they got bit by the dog, and then it seemed to subside for a number of years, but then something happened and it got really bad again when they were, let's say, age 14, for argument's sake. They watched a movie where there was a particular scene that was highly distressing, and then over the course of years and years, it wasn't too much of an issue. Progressively, it was no longer a problem and they just got on with their life. But that since they've been, let's say, 50, it's been a huge problem again. You can see a big spike there. And we might identify with them that what seemed to really elicit that big spike was that their own dog was attacked by another dog. And I do want to just note that experiences that are linked to phobia will not always be this obvious and this linear. So in this case, it's quite evident that it's dogs linked to dogs, if that makes sense, a fear of dogs linked to dog experiences. And that was really just for example's sake, just to give a really clear example on the PowerPoint screen. But I do want to encourage you to think about the fact that it's not always going to be simple like that. So for example, a person who has a flying phobia may not have had an experience of a plane crash, but there may have been experiences along the way where they felt trapped. And the sense of being entrapped led to a spike. So you can have instances along the timeline that may not be as obvious as these ones on this example here. So then what we do once we've got our graph is we decide which memories we're going to process and in which order. And the good news is we're using standard protocol, so there's nothing too complex or fancy about that there. It's really just about, as I said, target sequencing. That's what these methods are about, is helping us decide what targets we're going to address and in which order. So usually we start by targeting the earliest experience that caused the onset of the fear or the phobia. So in the case before, you'd see that is being bitten by the dog. And in EMDR therapy, we might call that like the touchstone experience. So the earliest experience that sort of laid the groundwork for the fear to develop. And then we usually move on chronologically to events on the timeline that have contributed to the fear spiking or worsening. And what you'll see here on the graph is that where you can see like a bend, if you like, in the graph, they're the ones that you want to be targeting, the ones where there is a peak. That demonstrates that there's something noteworthy that's happened in the client's life. So we may depart from this rule of thumb of starting with the earliest and then progressively working our way through for some, in some cases, for some reasons. So for example, it may be that the client says that a more recent experience, like on the graph here, witnessing their own dog being attacked, maybe a more recent experience that is highly intrusive for the person and causing them great disturbance. It may even have caused them to avoid going to parks altogether, and their dog may now, not be getting walked at all, whatnot. So we may find that there is reason on occasion to start with at a different point on the graph. And as I shared earlier with our three-pronged approach, past, present, and future, once we've targeted the past events, which are on the graph, we then want to identify, are there any present triggers remaining? Often those present triggers will have resolved by addressing and reprocessing the underlying core issues, the roots, if you like, of the tree. The AIP model posits that the memories are the cause largely of the presenting triggers. They may well have resolved, but if they haven't, we need to address them directly, and then we move on to a future template. And I'm going to talk about all of this a bit further in the training today. So again, come back to principles, not prescription. I think a rule of thumb in EMDR therapy is you start with the first, the worst, or the most recent. And you really can start with any of those. I think it's really important not to get too bogged down in stress about where you start. I think it's about what feels most relevant. I think if none of them seem to stand out more than another, go with first, because it is likely to be the core root underlying sort of beginnings of the fear. But if there is a recent experience that is highly distressing and feels much more relevant to the client's day-to-day functioning, or indeed there's another experience on the timeline that feels worse because it's just so disturbing, then you can start there as well. I'm just going to pause for a moment to have a glass of water. Please do pop anything in the chat box or pop your hand up if you do have any queries or comments about this first method. If anyone's tried this timeline method, I'd be very interested to hear how you've gone with it. Angela has preempted what I was about to say, which is so good. I love it when that happens. Angela said the timeline sounds like a great idea. It gets tricky with clients with GAD, and I could not agree more. Generalized anxiety disorder is actually very stubborn to treat, I think, in a lot of cases. My research in preparing for this training suggested that GAD often does have more of a temperamental personality aspect to it, and also often it can be so numerous in terms of the fears and concerns and experiences that it can be very difficult to isolate things on a timeline. So thanks, Angela. I'm certainly going to go on to address that now. Connie says, do you use float back technique to identify past experiences? You certainly can. I think the float back technique is always an excellent option if the client is not able to organically identify targets, and particularly when it comes time to targeting a specific memory. So you might have your map or your timeline, and then you're wanting to decide where to start. If the client is not able to connect with the affect or activate a target to be able to reprocess it, which of course we need to do to be able to successfully desensitize and reprocess it, I think the float back technique at that point can be really useful as a way of springboarding from the present to identify which target we can activate. For those who are not familiar with the float back technique, what it involves is asking the client to call to mind a recent or a current situation that is causing the disturbance. So in this case, the anxiety or the fear, and then to invite them to notice if there is a cognition that accompanies that. If there is, then great. If there isn't, then that's okay too. We get them to really tap into the disturbance that they feel in their body in the present moment when they call to mind that current or recent situation, and allow them to track back, not logically, but from that feeling to go back to an earlier experience as early as possible to see whether that feeling resonates with an earlier time. And then if you can activate something, then that's usually your target, depending on what comes up. Yeah. Stephanie's asked, do you use I think that means float back on each target stated on their timeline, just to be sure to elicit any implicit memories? Look, not routinely, but you certainly could, Stephanie, absolutely. Ad de Jong and his colleagues don't suggest that in the description of this particular case conceptualization method, but you certainly could do that, absolutely. I think the risk with this timeline method is that you probably are going to stay too much in the intellect. And so if you are expecting that there may be some pre-verbal or implicit memories, then I think absolutely you could work more from affect and float back. Absolutely. So following on from what Angela was just commenting on around generalized anxiety disorder, and also I think, things like severe social anxiety, where there's very strongly held core beliefs about self, there are likely going to be numerous memories. There's probably going to be more memories than can be meaningfully mapped on a timeline, or it can just be very overwhelming to know what to do. That's where the second method is most helpful here. So the second method, and again, this is not the only ways that you can elicit targets. I'm just presenting two particular options to you today here. The second method we can otherwise call the evidence method or the proof method. That's another phrase that often gets used. What we're doing here is we're springboarding not just from the symptom to a target, but more from a core belief. So the underlying rigid cognition that is fueling the persistent issue, whether it be GAD, whether it be social anxiety, and we use that as our springboard back to targets. So this is useful when a client's anxiety or fears tend to be driven by numerous memories or an underlying very rigid core negative belief. And so in these cases, it's more efficient and actually more useful to start with the core belief rather than to do a timeline, because it's much more likely to help us to get to the heart of what might be really going on, or to differentiate key memories that are relevant from the numerous memories that we might get up on a timeline. So what we do in this particular method is we start by identifying what's the most relevant negative core belief that's consistent with the current problem. So not just the symptom itself, but what's underpinning it. So is it something like I'm vulnerable, I'm powerless? Is it I'm worthless? If a person has social anxiety, for example, I'm a loser, I'm defective, I'm unlovable, I'm inadequate, I'm a failure for someone who's, continually perfectionistic perhaps. And we're going to talk a little more later about what sort of cognitions tend to come up for your clients. What we then want to do here is identify experiences that may have led to the development and the exacerbation of that negative core belief. and therefore prove it. Now, we're not saying obviously that we believe that these experiences prove it. This is about the client's distorted sense that these experiences provide evidence, so to speak. And so in this particular method, what we're doing is we're identifying what proof memories or experiences in their life they believe prove or demonstrate, A, that they developed this issue, and B, that it's continued to be an ongoing problem in terms of their core belief. And I'm going to talk a bit more about some examples in a moment. And so then what we're going on to do essentially, and I hate using the word discredit evidence, but you know what I mean. What we're trying to do here essentially is to dismantle this through reprocessing those memories. And what we're doing here is we're not doing it chronologically like on a timeline. So that's the other method. This method here is not about drawing a timeline. What we're wanting to do here is identify what experiences the client feels really prove to them that they're unworthy, for example. And then we start with the strongest evidence or memory that relates to the core belief and has the most oomph to it or the most power to it. Stephanie says, how do you elicit discussion about the core beliefs? Is there a core belief questionnaire you can give your client either at intake, or do you do this in session? I think that depends on how a person is trained. I mean, certainly a lot of EMDR therapists are schema trained as well, and they may use something like the Young Schema questionnaire and use some of the schema language to develop a framework and understanding. I'd be very interested if anyone else would like to pop in the chat box any things that you use particularly. There is a blocking belief questionnaire by Jim Knipe with a K, K-I-N-P-E, that I often use with clients, but that's more around things like ambivalence, secondary gain, and that sort of thing. Anyone who'd like to share anything in the chat box, please do, around how you elicit core beliefs. I think for me, often I just have conversations with clients in my psychoeducational discussions with clients around the development of these sorts of things and how these kind of difficulties can develop and get maintained over time. I would just have a conversation and provide perhaps some examples and help the client to draw out what things might be relevant for them. Tracy's saying she uses a list of negative cognitions. So of course, many of us, when we've done our basic EMDR training, will have the list of negative and positive cognitions. So certainly that indeed is a great way to do it as well. Lorraine Wright is saying schema. Angela, the downward arrow technique, if that were true, what does that say about you? Indeed, because with a core belief, we're not talking just about a surface level belief. It's much more about what does it mean at their core about them. Jess says, I find many times it just comes up spontaneously. They say, I'm always coming back to the fact that I'm a walking disaster. I use this statement and filter it down to deeper into a negative cognition. Yeah, thank you, Jess. That's great. I hope those are some helpful ideas there for you, Stephanie. So in terms of how we might go about this, so with this particular method, what you can actually say to the client is, what experiences in your life prove to you even now that you're a failure? Or what taught you that you're a failure? You can also ask, what age does that feeling of being a failure feel? And that's certainly where you can do some more somatic, sort of affective based float back type stuff, that those words, I'm a failure, what age does that feel? And just allow your mind to take you back to how early or young that feels. Or it could be who taught you that you were a failure. And also what recent situations in your life have made it clear to you that you are a failure. So essentially, we might even talk to the client about how, we're not saying that we actually believe this, but clearly they believe strongly that this is true, particularly for clients who have very rigidly held negative beliefs. And I guess it's about saying, if you imagine that you and I were having a debating competition, we're not going to, but imagine if I'm the adjudicator and you're having to really argue for why it is true that you're a failure, or that you're inadequate, or you're vulnerable, or you're powerless, or you're not safe, whatever it might be. What would be the experiences that you would use as evidence for that? So it could be a range of things. It could be a time that their mother was ill with a particular condition and was hospitalized for a period of time. That may have proven to the person that I'm all alone. Or it may be a time that their best friend turned on them. It may be that their partner left them for somebody else. It may be the time that they were fired from their job. It may be a time that they missed a penalty shootout in a really, really important soccer game, and it was the final moment and they effed it up and everybody was disappointed in them. It could be that their father didn't bother come to their year 6 graduation. That proved to them I'm worthless, for example. I'd like you to take a moment just to think about what experiences might relate to some of your clients. So this is a little metaphor just to think about what we're talking about here with this whole second method. So essentially the core belief is the key word, if you like, for the target search. And then the experiences in the client's life are the World Wide Web. So we're more or less doing a bit of a search. And I'm really keen for us not to get caught in the intellect here. And I think with these methods of case conceptualization and target sequencing, there is a bit of a risk that you can get a bit caught up in your head. So I would encourage you, as we've previously discussed today, to consider things like the float back concept if you feel that the client is getting too stuck in their head. So let's think now about what sorts of negative cognitions, so core beliefs, do we tend to see within our clients who have anxiety. And of course, it might be different for people who have, say, a phobia, or a person who has a panic disorder, a person with severe social anxiety. That's, I suspect, where some of the more self-worth based cognitions might be more present. I'd invite you in the chat box to write any negative cognitions that you commonly see in clients that have anxiety or phobias. Oh my goodness, I'm not good enough is the first 3. Common. I'm not capable. I'm weak. Can't handle this. Something wrong with me. Not safe. Can't trust. Not good enough. Not worthy. Can't do anything right. It's my fault. Yeah. So obviously these cognitions are not largely different from cognitions that we see really in trauma or in any other targets that we're working with in EMDR therapy. Damaged, hopeless, yeah. Useless or worthless, yeah. So of these 2 target methods, which should you choose? The answer is there's no right or wrong, and indeed these are not the only ways that you can target, select targets in EMDR therapy with anxiety disorders. These are just 2 ways that I wanted to share with you today. You can use any of the other methods that you're familiar with from your basic EMDR training or any additional training. When it comes though to these 2 methods, so the symptoms back to targets using the timeline method, and of course the float back technique can be utilized in that as well. I think that's probably, as I said earlier, most suited to disorders where there are quite sort of tangible experiences that led to the onset of the fear and have worsened the fear over the course of time, or indeed with something like panic disorder, the attacks themselves or humiliating experiences might be clear targets. I think the second method, where we're working more on identifying what's the underlying core belief, and then both cognitive proof memories, as in like, why do you genuinely believe this? What experiences in your life have proven to you that you are inadequate or that you're not good enough? And indeed, you can also use the float back as well to connect with that on an affective level. I think that tends to be more useful for things like, as we said before, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, or any anxiety disorder where a disturbed self-image plays a significant role. But ultimately, use your own clinical judgment as always. I'd like to invite some questions and discussion now. So If anybody has any particular questions, comments, or anything you'd like to discuss, I really like these sessions to be as engaging as possible. So can I invite you now to use the reactions button to raise your hand, and then Jay or I will call on you, and then you can unmute yourself and you can speak. And if you're not comfortable to speak out loud, you can write something in the chat box as well. Just like to get some conversation going now. Kate has asked regarding I'm not good enough, do people find this is self-imposed or externally imposed? That's a really good question. As we invite discussion now, I'd actually invite anybody to reflect on that and to share any of your own thoughts. I mean, I think it's both. I mean, I think people's experiences with caregivers, attachment figures throughout earlier years in life and then over the course of time certainly can send that message. And then we can have parts of self, if you like, that almost take on that messaging, so introjects of that, and then that could become self reinforcing over the course of time. I'd be very open to anyone else to say anything about that too, of course. Angela, you raised your hand. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment?
Hi, Carolyn. I'm just wondering how much of the things that we've covered today could be used for OCD.
Great question. I think all of it could be for OCD. I didn't include OCD in today's conversation simply because it's not technically an anxiety disorder, but it is very relevant. And as I mentioned early on, I think it does have a lot of things in common. So certainly I think that you could absolutely use these principles for that. I mean, these particularly the two methods of target selection that I have shared with you, they're not just for anxiety disorders. The reason why I'm presenting them today is they have particular relevance for these conditions, but you could certainly use them really for any clinical presentation that you feel has relevance.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Angela. Who else would like to share a reflection? It doesn't have to be a question. It could just be a comment. It could be anything that's resonating with you. It could be any case examples that you'd like to mention. While people are thinking, I'd invite you to pop in the chat box anything that's particularly stood out for you from the time today. It's really helpful for me as a presenter to get some feedback to help me to know whether I'm pitching this in a way that's helpful. So I'd be most keen to hear in the chat box or verbally if you'd like to share any things that have jumped out for you from what we've discussed today. Lorraine said you found this useful and validating. Thanks to hear. I'm glad to hear that. Thanks for sharing that, Lorraine. Feel free to pop anything else in there specifically. And just as saying, I enjoy working with a child who had a fear of a certain animal. When we processed, she not only had reduced fear, but pictured herself having a chat and getting to know the creature on a very personal level. It's so delightful. Jess, that is fantastic. It's really exciting. Was that through EMDR therapy, Jess, that you used? Angela's saying the second method would be good. I'm glad to hear. Great. Bonnie's saying, any ideas to help a client who has trouble wearing a CPAP machine mask at night? That's a really interesting one. Do you feel comfortable to unmute yourself, Honey, and just to speak with me about that? I'd find it helpful if I could just ask you a couple of things.
Oh, hi, Carolyn. Can you hear me?
I can.
Good. It's all working.
It sure is. Tell us about the situation, Honey, just to help me assist you in your question.
Yes, so a client in her 40s has sleep apnea, and so was prescribed to wear the CPAP machine mask, but has a lot of trouble being able to wear that. And when we did a clinical landscape in her history, there was a lot of abuse and neglect in her childhood. Even in her adult life, there's been, a carry on of more abuse, through ex-partners and things like that. we actually processed a lot of that quite well, over a long period of time. But the actual wearing of the CPAP mask, she was able to wear it, fall asleep, but then she would wake a few hours later and be unable to put it back on. And we got a little bit stuck with how to help there.
Absolutely. Keep yourself unmuted so that we can have a chat, Honey, if that's okay. Was there a particular negative cognition, do you think, that underpinned that fear?
I'm not safe. Very much I'm not safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And upon reflection, do you think there might be any of the earlier memories, we call them feeder memories, that still need to be further reprocessed? Or do you feel confident that all those past targets have held?
It's hard to say, Carolyn, because the history was quite complex and the abuse was quite severe. There was one particular of an ex-partner who sexually abused her with his hand over her mouth, and I think that had a pretty big bearing on that. And we did process it quite well, but I do wonder if it wasn't fully processed, whether there was just, and because of the childhood trauma even before that, I don't know if we've necessarily processed it all. But we did sort of move to processing actually wearing the mask, because I thought maybe move to the recent stimulus. But I've got a little bit stuck, so I wasn't sure.
Absolutely. And as always, there's a bit of choose your own adventure. There's going to be different options. And so if you think about the 3 prongs in EMDR therapy, obviously the past prong is highly relevant here, and you've done some amazing work by the sound of things. So I think firstly, I'd be inclined to check those targets again and to see whether any of those do need further work, or whether there are further experiences in the past that do need reprocessing. Because if she's had violent assaults or experiences where her airways were covered, it does that's likely to be linked. So certainly I'd want to go back there. And then if you think in the present prong, the actual CPAP machine itself might be the target, of course, and it might even be, depending on how, logistically you can manage this, you might even do some work with her wearing even the CPAP machine. And I'm going to talk later in the presentation today a bit about ways that we can activate targets if we need to, even with some props and things like that.
Okay.
Could even actually, get her to put on the machine and see what, or the mask, and see what gets triggered, and then process accordingly, or get her to visualize it in as much intensity. And then either just processing using standard protocol, the present trigger, which is wearing the mask, or if that doesn't seem to be clearing it, you could certainly, if you felt that there was still past targets, despite your best effort to logically get to those, you could certainly bring up the present disturbance, which is wearing the mask, and you need to really activate that, get that negative cognition of I'm not safe, and then use the float back technique and see what comes up from there. So I think really you're on the right track. I think it's probably just about persisting further in each of those different prongs. And then of course the future prong as well that we're going to talk together about today too, around a future template of being able to wear the mask with mask 3. And no doubt it's not comfortable, I'm sure, for her, but being able to cope, and what resources and tools she'd be able to use to manage if she woke up and settled herself to go back to sleep with it. I think the future prong would be most helpful as well. So I hope that's given you a few ideas.
Yes, thank you. Are you saying, if possible, to have the CPAP machine in the therapy session and actually put it on and evoke some emotions and process that?
I'm not suggesting you would have to do that by any stretch. You certainly could consider doing it. EMDR 2.0 is a very recent innovation in EMDR therapy that I'm not going to talk about at length, but I will mention later. And one of the principles in that very recent innovation is that if a client is struggling to activate a target in session, sometimes we can use quite creative means, including, essentially some in vivo exposure to really activate it. I'm not suggesting you'd have to do that. If the client is able to get in touch with the disturbance just by visualizing it, then that's fine. But it may be interesting to see whether it would be of any additional benefit to consider that. I'm not sure.
Great. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Kay just said I had a client who had a very negative experience with a dentist as a child, couldn't wear a mask, hand over the mouth, as you mentioned. Yeah, absolutely. Indeed. Does anybody have any other questions, comments? I'm glad to hear that the two methods of the case conceptualization are resonating for a number of people. Does anybody have any question about them? Are there any points that are unclear? Okay, if not, we'll continue on just for a few minutes and then we're going to be taking a break shortly as well. So when we think now about phase 2 in EMDR therapy, before I go on, I can just see a question has come up. Any thoughts around hoarding, Caroline? Could this be treated as anxiety related? Yes, indeed. Again, it's not in the DSM criteria as an anxiety disorder, but it certainly does have some relevance indeed. I haven't treated hoarding disorder extensively myself. It just hasn't been something that's come up in my clinical work, but certainly I think it would have a lot of link to what we're talking about here. And you mentioned attachment issues potentially. In essence, I think it would depend on the individual client and their particular circumstances. And Angela, is your hand up at the moment, or is it just from before? Might just be from before. Kyla's asking, how would you visually map out the core beliefs to target? Look, I think you could do that in a number of creative ways, and you wouldn't even need to visually represent it necessarily. The way that it's taught by De Jong and his colleagues doesn't include an actual physical map as such, but you could certainly, any way, whether it be on a whiteboard or whether it be on butcher's paper, or you could draw it out in any way. I personally haven't had a particular way that I visually link it. But you might just, write a list of the core beliefs and then draw some arrows perhaps or something. If anyone has any ideas, then by all means, pop them in the chat box. So when we think now about phase 2 in EMDR therapy, this is the procedural preparation and the resourcing phase. So it goes without saying that we need to resource all of our clients, even clients who have anxiety and may not have complex trauma. So the resourcing phase in EMDR therapy is going to be varied. I think it's actually the most varied phase in EMDR therapy. So for some clients, it may be 1 session, 2 sessions. For other clients, it may be months, depending on the particular individual client. So I often find that this iceberg metaphor is quite helpful. What I do with clients is I actually draw this, talking about visually representing things. I draw this on a whiteboard. So what I do is I draw an iceberg and I say at the top of what we see above the surface of the water is the tip of the iceberg. And essentially that's the symptoms. That's what we see day to day. So the anxiety that you're feeling, the fear, all of the different things that are happening day to day. And that's often a good place to start. Underneath the surface is what we see beneath the surface of the water. And that's what we're going to get to when it comes to addressing the underpinning issues. So this iceberg metaphor is something that I often explain to clients really early on at the outset of therapy. I'm mentioning it now in phase 2 because I think it's often relevant to when we do resourcing with clients, but certainly I would often mention it to people at the beginning when I'm giving a bit of a map or a bit of a sense of how we're going to progress forward with treatment. So just a little helpful metaphor that I find to be most helpful, because most clients find, I think, that we do need to start with a few little ideas around how they can manage their disturbance through things like breathing strategies, grounding, mindfulness, before we then get into what's underneath the surface and actually do reprocessing. So psychoeducation is helpful, and one of my favorites is the smoke alarm. So this is just a little reminder, I guess, about that, the idea that the smoke alarm is a bit like the amygdala in the brain, that the amygdala is our fight flight indicator, signals to the body that there is danger, that something is happening, and signals us to go into that fight flight reaction. And so I think it's quite useful to explain to clients that the smoke alarm is a good metaphor to help us understand what can happen in an anxiety disorder. So we all have a smoke alarm, we all have an amygdala. Our amygdala goes off when we are in danger, and indeed we need it to. However, if a smoke alarm gets oversensitive, which is what can happen in our houses, a smoke alarm can go off even when there's just some burnt toast in the kitchen. The smoke alarm thinks that there is a fire when there actually isn't. In the same way, our own amygdala or our own smoke alarm can go off. And what can happen is that it can signal danger even when there isn't danger. And we can feel as though we are in danger a lot of the time. And that can be understandably very unsettling for people. So I think that's quite a useful metaphor to explain that part of what we're going to do is help to retrain that smoke detector, because we still need it. It's very important. We want it to go off, though, when there actually is a threat, not when there isn't real danger. And I'm not going to go into this in any particular detail today, but I did just want to flag that I think things like the polyvagal theory do have a lot of really useful points to contribute to the conversation with clients around ways in which we can work both in the therapeutic relationship, but also in their own day-to-day life as well, in terms of being able to learn the difference between being shut down, fight, flight, and then that social nervous system being connected socially with others and in therapy as well. Kate said, are there good psych ed client handouts for the smoke alarm? I haven't found any. Do you know, I actually don't have any particularly. I'm sorry, it's a metaphor that I've heard a number of people talk about, but I'm not particularly familiar with any specific handouts. You could certainly Google it and see what you find. I might just make one myself. I suppose that's a good start. If anybody does have access to a useful handout, then please do feel free to pop it in the chat box. And if anyone's new to the polyvagal theory or is interested in learning more about it, I'd suggest that you go to Deb Dana's really excellent website, which is Rhythm of Regulation, which is a great website there. And we'll just have one more slide before we go to our break in a moment, just to talk a little bit briefly about resourcing and skill building. I did just want to give a bit of a shout out to Mark Grant, who was my EMDR consultant for 2 years. Mark Grant is the developer of a fabulous resource called the Anxiety Release app. There are a number of other apps that he's also developed. One's called Overcoming Pain. One is called Sleep Restore. And so essentially that is an app that includes some bilateral stimulation and auditory form, and you can also watch the app and there's a visual component as well. There is also some guided meditation essentially that he includes on that app as well. So this is a really useful app that I've often shared with clients in that, if you like, addressing the tip of the iceberg stuff, and they can continue to use it over the course of their life as they continue to proactively handle their anxious thoughts, feelings, sensations. And so essentially this is not about trauma reprocessing at home, it's about being able to quite confidently utilize a tool that is inclusive of bilateral stimulation to support a person to manage their anxiety when it shows up. So it might be that they have a job interview coming up and that they listen to it. It might be that they are having trouble going to sleep at night. The Sleep Restore one's particularly good for that. So just love to give a little plug to that app, which I give a lot of clients. I will say that whenever I share an app with a client, I always do like to talk it through with the client in session. I think that that's much more helpful than just saying, oh, here's an app, go try it. The other one called Worry Time is another free app. I shouldn't say another free app. Mark Grant's app does actually cost a few dollars. I think it's about $8 from memory, but Worry Time is a free app. It's based on the concept of worry postponement or having worry time. So essentially each time that you have a worry, you note it in the app, and then at a certain time the app notifies you, and then you can have a look through the worries, and then essentially, as you can see on the far right, scrunch a little worry and sort of flick it off the screen. It's really around being able to unhook from ruminations. It's particularly good good for GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, or ruminations, being able to really make a brief sort of acknowledgement of a worry without engaging with it. So you're only going to be focusing on those thoughts during your worry time. Just having a little look what we've got in the chat box here. Angela said, I found that clients with anxiety get worried about the autonomic ladder and fixate on being in dorsal. That's really interesting. I haven't experienced that, Angela, but I'm certainly not denying that that's been your experience. Good to know. Good to know. Lisa said there's an easy book called Help, I've Got an Alarm Bell Going Off in My Head that's similar to the smoke alarm that you can use with clients. A number of people have said that the Mark Grant apps are great. Fantastic. Is Jess is saying Worry Time and Sleep ones are free. Certainly Worry Time is free. The Sleep Restore app, which is Mark Grant's one, I believe that there's a free version and then there's a paid version that you can get as well if you want to upgrade. Okay, so I think that's a really good time for us to take a break. I'm just going to stop my sharing. Anybody have any reflections? Anything that's coming up for you, or just anything you'd like to share at this point in the training?
One comment.
Yes, Peter, hi.
Hi, Carolyn. Cognitive interweaves. That was interesting. I connected that with the evidence. So yesterday I was seeing a 35-year-old lady, and she was anxious, and basically her father walked out of the house when she was 11 years old. And so what she believed was that there was something wrong with her. She'd caused her father to leave. And so the interweave was, well, it's not your fault. You know, it's your father's lack of judgment or skills or whatever. So that was interesting in terms of, you know, is there anything that you're experiencing, or what evidence do you have that there is something wrong with you?
I'm glad that was helpful for you, Peter. Thanks for sharing. Does anyone have any other reflections? Any questions at this point?
Caroline, this is more of a question. Hi. I'm just wondering about GAD and treating it with EMDR, and, you know, sort of hearing a couple of things today that it's not so easy to maybe treat with the first approach, the time using the charting it on the sort of timeline thing. But then someone else in the chat said the second approach could be really useful for treating GAD. And I just wonder whether you had any comment about that, because it sounds like it is quite a little bit tricky to treat.
Yeah, look, I think it's a very fair question, and I think it would depend a lot on the clinical profile of the client and the case-by-case sort of factors. So I don't think that it's as simple as one or the other is the right way to approach GAD, but I do think that GAD does, in my clinical experience, does tend to be very persistent and does tend to be quite far-reaching in its scope, and so therefore it may not be as easily attributed to specific experiences that can be really pinned down, in which case the second approach may be more fruitful in trying to elicit targets. Does anybody have any other reflections or just any experience of treating GAD, not just with EMDR therapy, but with any approach? We are going to talk today about how we integrate EMDR with other therapies, because I think it's necessary with GAD. Does anyone have any experience of what's worked well for your clients with GAD?
Caroline, something that I've worked with generalized anxiety, this is Massa here, that's worked really well is really working with the body and really noticing where that alarm system is, and just being able to deactivate the alarm in the body in terms of the arousal, and that tends to work well with GAD, because they seem to have so many times in a day where the alarm system goes off. So working with the body, the polyvagal stuff, along with EMDR, I found to be very helpful.
Thank you. That's so useful to hear your experience. Does anyone have anything else you'd like to share about this? Okay. Any other reflections or comment or question about anything that we've covered in the training so far? All right. One thing I wanted to just check before we continue is, has anybody had any experience using Mark Grant's anxiety release based on EMDR app with clients, or indeed personally? And if so, what's been your experience? No.
Hi, Caroline. It's Michelle. I've quite a few of my clients have downloaded the app and they find it. I haven't used it myself personally, but I've definitely had that in session with clients. But even my online clients also, and they found it very good. The same with overcoming pain. So I have clients with fibromyalgia that have really found that app useful as well. So I highly recommend these apps.
Great. Fantastic. Because look, I think it is really important for me to just say at various points throughout the presentation that EMDR therapy, in my humble opinion, is not intended to be in a vacuum. I think some people are purist when it comes to any approach, but certainly the way that I like to approach any treatment is in an eclectic way. And I think EMDR therapy has so much to offer with respect to the broader framework of how we conceptualize the client's difficulties, and certainly targeting experiences in that client's life that are relevant, that need to be addressed. And I think it's also really important that we are empowering and skilling our clients up to be able to handle their anxiety, as Marcia was saying, being able to support them with the physiological arousal that occurs in the body, and rumination. I mean, things like unhooking skills in ACT. I mean, all of this stuff is highly relevant. And so I really want to just reiterate that along the way, that I have deep respect for other therapies, and particularly I think in phase 2, in the preparation phase in EMDR therapy, how I mentioned before, the iceberg metaphor, starting, in a lot of cases above what we see, or what we see above the water, which is the tip of the iceberg. Empowering someone to be able to handle their anxiety more effectively is going to be a very important step toward being able to get to the bottom of it. So, and apps like Mark Grant's anxiety release app, it's a really nice marriage, I think, between the EMDR principles and indeed bilateral stimulation, but also other concepts such as meditation and guided imagery and that sort of thing as well. So yeah, very, very useful. So Kylie said, I agree, Michelle, the anxiety app with bilateral stimulation is really helpful for keeping calm during sessions, managing ups and downs and reactions from the nervous system and negative beliefs. I'm glad to hear. Fantastic. Okay, well, if there aren't any additional questions or comments at this stage, we will now move on to going back into our presentation. Can I just invite you to mute yourself if you haven't done so already? So just to pick up from where we left off before, we are talking now about phase 2 in EMDR therapy, and resourcing, of course, is a part of this for many clients. And so I just wanted to touch briefly on resourcing. This is potentially going to be a revision for some of you, but I do think it's really important that we're all confident around how we resource our clients. And I just want to reiterate what I said a moment ago, that other therapeutic approaches such as DBT skills, ACT skills, relaxation, mindfulness, all of that, of course, body-based work, yoga, is highly relevant as well in all of this too. When it comes to resourcing in a more classic sense in EMDR therapy, what we're talking about is the idea of being able to, quote unquote, install resources, so help a person to connect, usually through visualization, with something like a calm place, or it might be a nurturing figure, or it might be a time in their life where they experienced a sense of confidence, being able to really call that up and create a lovely image of that, connect with where they feel that in the body, and then do some short, slow bilateral stimulation to really sink that in. I guess it's helpful to explain to clients that neuroplasticity helps us understand that the brain is continually changing and that new neural pathways are being developed throughout our life. And just because we may not have learnt strategies for coping with our anxiety when we were little, or we may not feel that we're as equipped as we might need to be, that there is hope. The brain can grow, can change. And the way I often explain it to clients is, if you imagine we've been driving down the same old path or walking the same old walking track over and over again. That might be through avoidance, it might be through safety behaviors, it might be through certain compulsions. What we're wanting to do here really is create a new path, and that does take repetition. It's like you're bush bashing through a new path. If you imagine walking through a field, if you've walked that 1,000 times, it's going to be well trodden. It takes time to build a new path, but that's what we're doing through resources. And resources are about both external resources, but of course internal resources to help a person feel stronger and more confident to handle their daily ups and downs. And the fact that anxiety is a part of all of our lives means that we need to learn how to handle it effectively. And it's also incredibly useful for being able to safely approach painful memories and traumatic memories through EMDR reprocessing as well. I just wanted to make a little note about bilateral stimulation at this point. So different trainers teach, I guess, differently with respect to the emphasis that's put on using slow bilateral stimulation. Some don't emphasize it as highly, but certainly the way that I teach is that we've got the pedals of a car, if you like. So we've got the accelerator of a car is like fast bilateral stimulation. It moves things along, it gets things going. And so we're desensitizing when we use fast. And that's not just trauma, that can be defenses, it can be things like urges if we're treating addictions. There's a whole range of different things. It can be if a person with anxiety is engaging in repetitive safety behaviors and they feel a sense of relief and control. We could even be targeting that maladaptive positive affect, the control or the relief. And then slow bilateral stimulation. And what I mean by slow is very slow. So the equivalent of sort of like my fingers so, or it might be, if you're doing butterfly taps, just nice, gentle, slow taps like that. That's what we use when we're doing resourcing. So the idea there is that when we're doing resourcing in phase 2, indeed at any point in therapy, and particularly in the future template work that we're going to come to talk about later, that's where we would be doing short, slow sets of bilateral stimulation. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Laurel Parnell. Laurel Parnell is an American EMDR trainer who also does a lot of work with what she calls resource tapping. And so essentially this is just a way of doing bilateral stimulation through a tactile form. So literally they call it the butterfly hug because it looks like a butterfly, or it can be on the shoulders, or it can be on your knees. There's lots of ways that we can do it. The client can do their own self-tapping. We, of course, perhaps less in COVID times, but can tap on the client's knees as well, potentially. The idea is, as I said before, when we're doing an installing of a resource, we can tap it in, so to speak. And Laurel Parnell has a book called Tapping In, which is a really lovely resource that many clients, I think, have benefited from. Sue's just asked about what would maladaptive positive affect be. Essentially, what that means there, Sue, is that in EMDR therapy, we're not just desensitizing distress. That's, of course, a large part of it, but we're desensitizing anything that's maladaptive. And what I mean by maladaptive is something that's not, serving the system, I suppose. And so, for example, like in that example that I gave before, if you've got a client who's engaging in a behavior that actually feels good, like it brings some relief, control, or feels better, but is actually problematic and the person wants to stop or reduce, you actually, we're not going to cover this in detail today, but you actually can use EMDR desensitization to actually desensitize, quote unquote, the good feeling that is linked to that behavior. It's the same principle that we use in the addiction protocols in EMDR therapy. So if somebody engages in a particular substance and they feel a euphoric feeling, you can desensitize the euphoric feeling. That's the maladaptive positive affect. Positive in the sense that it feels good, but it's maladaptive. A couple of other brief examples might be a person who's in a relationship that is unsafe. They may find themselves leaving the relationship, but then feeling compelled to keep returning to the relationship. The attachment or the idealization of the partner might be the maladaptive positive affect. that we might target. Another example might be a client who engages in self-injurious behavior. They might cut and feel some real benefit of that. And it may be that we target that feeling that they derive from engaging in that. And certainly with things like eating disorders, if a person engages, as Olivia said, thank you, in restriction of food and feels a sense of control from that, then that's something we could certainly target as well. And the list goes on. There's just so many different ways that we can do that. And in terms of defenses that we can target, if you're working with a client who has a particular protector part, and the part, so to speak, is feeling a sense of containment or relief or control by not allowing the system to feel the pain associated with the trauma that needs to be processed, that defense, that urge to avoid the trauma can be desensitized as well. So it's pretty cool. So just briefly, I wanted to just reiterate what you may have already learned in training previously, but just as a lovely reminder to everybody, this is how we do installing of a resource in EMDR therapy. So it doesn't really matter what the resource is, whether it's a calm place, whether it's a nurturing figure, a protective figure, a memory of a time when the client themselves felt a sense of courage, like it may be that they've got a job interview coming up and they're highly anxious about it, and you invite them to think of a time when they did face something difficult and had mastery. They call it to mind. So let's say that we start with them getting calm, we identify what they need, they call it to mind, they visualize that situation in as much detail as possible. We strengthen it by engaging the senses, so asking them to really think of what they could see, what they could hear, what they could smell, really enlivening that experience in their mind's eye. So this is usually through imagination. You could do drawing or symbol work, but generally imagination. And then noticing, where do you feel it in your body now when you think of it? And then if it's possible, that's where you can do, as Laurel Parnell calls it, the tapping in, or you can do some short, slow sets of eye movements. It doesn't really matter. It can either be the client doing a short, slow set. And when I say short, I mean just no more than 4 to 6 passes, and a pass is back and forth. That's one pass. It can be eye movements. I often find, though, that tapping either on the client's knees, you tapping, or the client doing self-tapping, or them holding little TheraTappers, buzzies or headphones, I find that often works better with resourcing rather than eye movements, because they can close their eyes and really tap into the resource. I find that eyes open with the eye movements can sometimes distract from that. Tracy's mentioned in resource therapy, then we anchor in with a symbol or an animal. Yeah, that's really lovely, Tracy. So of course, there's lots of different ways that we can resource in different therapies. Yeah, thank you. And it wouldn't be a Caroline Burrows training if I didn't mention parts work, because as most of you know, this tends to be something that I prattle on about much of the time, and it's beyond the scope of today's training to talk about parts work in any detail. If you are interested in doing additional training on my website, you'll find I do have a number of on-demand trainings in EMDR and parts work. They're by far my most popular trainings, because this stuff is so useful, and there's lots of other trainers, of course, that do train in various parts models, including the lovely Tracy just before, who mentioned resource therapy. I understand she trains in that. So parts work, essentially what I mean here is that when you're working with clients who have anxiety, I think it's very important to consider whether there may be the presence of different parts. And now what I mean by parts is I'm not talking DID or even necessarily dissociative parts. There may be, certainly could be, but there may be just ego states. We all have different aspects of self. The part of us that feels strong and capable, the part of us that feels vulnerable and small, the part of us that's able to put our game face on and get on with the day, even if we're feeling terribly small inside. The part of us that's able to, get our kids up and go to school, even if we're feeling really sick, whatever it might be. So I think it's important to really conceptualize anxiety from this lens for a moment, which is that often when we have a client who's highly anxious, it's a part of them that is holding a lot of the anxiety and is likely fueling certain behaviors, whether it be safety behaviors or sort of compulsive behaviors, avoidance, for example. And there's likely to be a more adult self, a more healthy part that actually knows that they are safe and that they're not actually dying, or that the panic attack is just a panic attack, or that to leave their house is actually safe, or that they're not going to be ridiculed when they speak in a group of people. But the parts that are holding the fear and the anxiety can be very strong, and very importantly are likely serving a protective function. So I think it's really important to hold this in mind and not to just treat symptoms, but to really think about what's the underlying function. You know, if there is a part that more or less has got that smoke detector going off all the time and is signaling danger, danger, warning, warning, and signaling to the rest of the system, you know, you've got to avoid going out, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you know, it's no doubt for a very compelling reason, which is to feel safe. And so what I've got on there is just a few little tidbits about working with parts that's obviously beyond the discussion for today, but really in essence, the most important thing I think is to be curious, not judgmental, to work toward collaboration of parts, not elimination, and that in time means that those parts that are anxious can actually be settled and can feel like they have a voice without needing to hijack or disrupt the whole system. And then it does also help get these parts on board, quote unquote, for getting into processing the underlying issues or trauma that the client may need to address. So one of those common questions that I mentioned earlier is how much resourcing is required? Well, there's, you know, no answer to that really, because it depends entirely on each individual client and how long is a piece of string. But I think we need to remember that phase 2 in EMDR therapy is highly variable. Different clients will need different amounts of resourcing. And two of my most favorite trainers, Dolores Mosquera and Annabelle Gonzalez, who talk a lot about EMDR, not so much for anxiety, but more for dissociation and complex trauma, have got some helpful ideas on this front, which I do think are still relevant for our clients with anxiety, which is these are a few indicators that a client may be ready to start to step into going beneath the surface of the iceberg's surface, if you know what I mean, you know, really getting into the processing of the underlying adverse experiences or trauma. So firstly, can they maintain dual awareness at the same time that they call to mind this experience or talk about it? Are they aware that they are here in the present and have at least a foot in the here and the now? Secondly, are they able to safely self-regulate? And that would be through things like the apps we mentioned before, deep breathing, DBT skills, unhooking from thoughts, yoga, whatever it might be. Ideally that they can self-regulate, but at the very least that we can co-regulate in therapy with the client. So if they become distressed, that we can support them to get grounded and to come back to the present and to feel safe. Thirdly, can they notice their body and tolerate physical sensations? As has been said by a number of people already, anxiety is often very visceral, very physical. And if somebody has anxiety about their safety or their health, then often they're likely to feel quite unsettled in their own body, and their nervous system may be quite activated to the extent that they may not even feel that they can really trust their body's cues, or they may have pain in their body, which can be very triggering as well. So for clients to be able to safely get into trauma reprocessing, we do need them to be able to notice their body and tolerate sensation without becoming flooded or going into dorsal vagal shutdown. So that's, again, something we can work with clients on. If we are working from that parts perspective, we do want parts to be on board with the trauma reprocessing, so the whole system to be on board. And what I mean by that is at the start of a desensitization session, it can be helpful to say to the client, are there any objections from any part of you? How do the parts of you that we've talked about previously feel about what we're going to do together today? Are there any concerns? Does any part of you need us to do anything in particular to feel comfortable for us to go ahead? And finally, that the client has social support in place, at the very least that they are able to reach out to emergency services if they do need support. So ideally that they have informal supports, friends, family and others, but at the very least, as I said, that they can and will connect in with professional supports if needed. I'd like to invite questions, discussion at this point. Either in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself. Raise your hand. I might ask a specific question to get some discussion going. Has anybody had any experience working with parts and anxiety? Tracy says, yep. Care to share anything, Tracy? No pressure, but if anyone would like to share, I'd be very interested to hear how you've found that useful.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can. Go for it.
Yeah, like Caroline, I'm a real fan of parts therapy and find it a really useful adjunct to EMDR. And I often find that there are protector parts that are very engaged in therapy. And I really like that concept of like resistance alliancing. So rather than trying to get rid of those protector parts, really being curious about what their purpose is, and then exploring keeping the purpose, which is often, you know, a good purpose of protection, but being curious as part of the process of how we can keep a protective factor there that might not necessarily include anxiety.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think those principles are absolutely aligned with what I was saying before. And I think a tendency in parts work sometimes is for people to try to ask parts to step aside. And I think that unfortunately, while that's very well intended, and I'm not trying to criticize anyone if they do that in their therapy, sometimes I think what we can find is that parts can flare up basically because they might feel like their survival is being threatened essentially if we're asking them to step aside when they actually may feel like they have a very important purpose to play. So as Tracy was saying around aligning with these parts or developing an alliance, I think it's really about, you know, how can these parts have their voice heard and their needs met in ways that don't need to hijack the whole system or stop the whole system from being able to get on with getting on. And I think that a very helpful underlying principle is that there's a common goal between the healthy adult part or parts and other parts. Ultimately, I think all parts do want the same thing at the end of the day, which is to be safe and to have an alleviation of suffering. There may be a range of ways that they go about it, but coming back to those basic principles around common goal can be helpful. Kylie, you had your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, look, I was just going to go on from what you were both saying then in regard to parts work and just some of the success that I've had using it to help people to self-care and nurture themselves and to accept where they're at. And I think, you know, it's such a great tool to, one of the things that I think you teach very well, Caroline, with this is that you're wanting to integrate and connect the parts and stop using them as enemies or fearful parts of you or evil parts, you know, because I think that continues to, it continues the story and the dialogue that you're not good enough and that you're a bad person and that you know, so if you can help them to think about ways, you know, of connecting in with them and what does that part actually need to hear from the adult person now, you know, because often when you're exploring those parts, they're not the adult, they're a younger age or a teenager or a, you know, whatever it might be. And I think some of those questions from Fraser's dissociative table and that sort of thing can be really helpful in asking your clients when those parts keep coming up, you know, what do they need from you now? What do they, you know, that sort of stuff. Really successful with that. Yeah.
Great to hear. That's wonderful. Michelle saying if you invite parts to be present, more parts can then also benefit from the reprocessing. That's very true. Absolutely. Yeah. So does anybody have any other comments or questions? Oh, Angela said, how do you work with the body when they're always hypersensitive about body sensations? Look, I think that's a very fair question. I mean, one thing that comes to mind for me is a technique, I think that may be linked to Peter Levine's work around titration or pendulation between a part of the body that is uncomfortable or unsettling and observing that mindfully for a very short period of time. seconds even, and then switching attention to a part of the body that is neutral. It might be like the right big toe or your left ear or something, and observing that with mindfulness and curiosity, and then pendulating back to the place of discomfort, and so on and so forth, back and forth. That's one example of something that I've tried in my work and found has been very helpful. I think there's also lots of other different ways, sensory motor processing and other somatic experiencing techniques as well. But I think for me, it's about titration and not throwing the person in at the deep end, but doing it gradually, little by little. Anyone else? If anyone else would like to make a comment, please don't hesitate to pop that in the chat box as well. Nicola says, how do you distinguish between flooding and deep, intense emotion during desensitization? I think it's difficult to say, categorically, but I think for me, it's about, is the client present enough that they have one foot in the here and now? You know, that dual awareness concept that I mentioned before, as long as there is one foot in the present, as in they are aware that they are here and now and that they are safe. I think if the client starts to relive the memory in such a way that it's suggestive that they have completely lost contact with the present moment. An example might be if a client starts rocking and saying, you know, I can't get out, I can't get out, I can't get out. You know, it's suggestive that they're actually having a re-experiencing and they're reliving that memory to the degree that they're not in the room with you. Does anyone have any other comment about any of this? This is some great stuff, some really interesting questions that are coming up. Okay, if not, we will continue on. So we're going to talk now about some specific processes and protocols that we can use when we're treating anxiety disorders with EMDR therapy, and the flash forward procedure is a really common one. Good old Ad de Jong and Logie have developed this. I just want to say at the outset that the standard protocol is still our foundation for all of this. And so any procedures that I'm teaching you here really fit within the standard protocol. I think it can be confusing. We can feel like, well, we've got the standard protocol, we've got this, we've got that, like, what are we doing here? Essentially, if you've got a client and it makes sense to just use standard protocol, then by all means do that. If you have a client who has particular concerns that are, as the flash forward procedure suggests, are catastrophic in nature about a future feared event, then you would use the flash forward procedure within the greater framework of the EMDR standard protocol. And I'll talk more about what that looks like. So what is a flash forward? The concept of a flash forward was actually first mentioned in 2007 by Holmes and colleagues, so not related to EMDR therapy. Interestingly, the term was originally used to describe suicide-related images, so future-focused images. And other authors have also talked about it being almost like flash forwards being a bit like an echo of a flashback in PTSD. So this concept of mental representations of fear, doom scenarios and catastrophes is not something that is unique just to EMDR therapy. So a flash forward is an image or a mental representation of something that is unlikely to happen, but is highly feared, that is irrational and is catastrophic in nature and is future focused, and usually highly disturbing and may be very intrusive. So where do these come from? So they can come from actual experiences, so trauma, or they can come from having seen something horrible happen, so vicariously observing something or something in, family of origin or in other circumstances. It can also be things like hearing stories of somebody, having a horrible experience or a very protracted death and imagining what that might have been like. Sometimes our experiences in therapy can be quite vicariously traumatizing, imagining, things that might have happened for clients. We may go on to then fear that something terrible might even happen for us or our loved ones. Books, news, movies, there's a whole range of different things that can create these images of flash forwards. So what actually is the flash forward procedure? So the flash forward procedure is essentially the standard protocol, like it really follows the same sort of steps. But what it is it's a way of targeting this particular type of issue for a client. So rather than targeting past traumas, we're targeting a presently held future fear that is catastrophic in nature. We're using the standard protocol to do that though. So essentially the easiest way to explain it is that this is just, again, a way of organizing targets when you're working with clients who have phobias or have fears that are future focused and catastrophic in nature. Interestingly, in the three-prong approach, past, present, and future, a little surprisingly to me, Ad de Jong and his colleagues suggest that this fits within the second prong in EMDR therapy, which is the present prong. The reason for that is even though it's future focused in nature, it is presently held and it is triggered by present circumstances. And so they would suggest that the past, of course, is past experiences. Present can be any present trigger, including these catastrophic images, and that the future is more that resourcing of a future template. Interesting. I'd be quite curious to hear if others were similarly surprised that that would be where it fit. I might have thought it might fit in the future prong in EMDR therapy, but I'm keen to share it as it was intended by the authors. So with the flash forward procedure, what we do is we want to determine what the target is. So the target in this case is not a past trauma or indeed any past event. It is the feared catastrophic event that is called the flash forward. So that little quote there is a way that you might ask a client. So we need to figure out what kind of image is in your head that makes you so scared about a future confrontation with what you're fearing. So if it's a person who is frightened of needles, it's when you think about having the vaccination or an injection or the medical procedure, the blood test, you know, what are you fearing? What is the absolute worst case scenario? We're looking for the ultimate doom scenario here. We then, through Socratic questioning, follow the event to its ultimate conclusion. And before I go on, I did just want to mention in the resources that I emailed you, I've actually detailed this entire process, so you've got that ready to follow in your work. We don't want to just stop with the first thing the client says. We want to look for the catastrophe beyond the catastrophe. So what would be the absolute worst thing about that? Why would that be so terrible? And we want to repeat that questioning until the client can't give us any response. So sometimes even the client's own death may not be the last of it. It may be, and what would be the absolute worst thing about you dying? It may be my child would never know who I was, or my partner would be all alone and kill themselves, or something. I mean, you know, this is awful to even suggest, but these are the sorts of fears that people might have. So you've got to look for what's the greatest source of the absolute catastrophe for the client. Once we've got to that point that we know what the absolute doom scenario is for the person, we then want to elicit an image of that flash forward, and that's your target for reprocessing. So the target is not a past event, it's a future catastrophic fear, and it needs to be a still image, not a video, that is detailed, intrusive and distressing, and we want it to be related to the client's symptoms. So if you're targeting a particular phobia, presumably the flash forward would be in relation to a confrontation with that thing or situation that they are fearing. If it's a person who has illness anxiety, it would potentially be in relation to the absolute worst case scenario, in relation to their health or death or dying, in relation to flying on an aeroplane. If that's a phobia, the person would be wanting to identify what's the absolute worst case scenario, and so on and so forth. And as I go on to talk about in a few minutes, we don't just use this for phobias. It can be used in a whole lot of different ways. So once we've got our target, which is the flash forward that I've just mentioned, we then use the standard EMDR steps to reprocess it. So I won't go through those in detail because we're trained in the standard protocol, but we set up the target in the same way we would normally. We then desensitize it, standard protocol. We do an installation of the positive cognition. We do a body scan, and then we do closure, and then we reevaluate the next session. And of course, if at any point it doesn't fully resolve, we can close it as an incomplete session. Just like we normally would, we would use our same unblocking techniques and interweaves that we would use in any standard procedure. Common negative and positive cognitions for flash forward are often things like I'm powerless, I have no control. And positive cognition may be something like I have some control or I can handle it. They're pretty common ones. So if your client is struggling, you may be able to assist them with that. Connie said, would flash forward work for a new mum who's developed anxiety and fear of losing her child and family? Yes, it would. That would be a very useful application, I think. Olivia says, why would we look for a detailed and still image rather than run through a movie of the scenario and pause it on the worst part? Great point, Olivia. You certainly could run through a movie and then you would want to pause on the worst part. So to get to the still image, you could run a video. But just as we do in standard protocol, we do want to have quite a tangible target. So what you've proposed is a reasonable suggestion. You would want to end up on the still image though. And look, I'm not entirely sure why it's suggested to do that. My best guess is that I think it just makes it very tangible with what we're targeting. So when we do a target check, we know exactly what we're coming back to. Would this work for performance anxiety? Yes, it would, Kim, I think. Absolutely. We're going to have an opportunity in a few minutes to talk about scenarios in which this might work, and we can brainstorm as a group. So once we have got through the standard steps, and I will just go back a step. So once we've done the setup of the target, we've desensitized it, we've done the installation, we've got a clear body scan. So we're now at the point where we've done our standard steps. There's another little step that we want to add in just to make sure that we're really clear that the target is resolved. So essentially, this is like a future template type of scenario that we're starting to work toward. So we're now asking the client, now that we've desensitized it and we've installed the positive cognition and it's clear, imagine yourself stepping into a scene of a future confrontation of the situation we've been working on. Close your eyes, play a movie from start to finish, and just allow each component of it to play through, imagining yourself coping well. So this is not catastrophe stuff here. We've already desensitized it. This is imagining yourself managing it fine. So maybe, for example, if somebody has a fear of an injection and you're imagining having the injection, walking into the clinic, checking in, rolling up your sleeve, preparing, whatever it might be, feeling the needle going in. So it's working your way through each component and being able to manage. There may be, some discomfort, but you handle it well. You utilize your skills, you utilize your tools. And this is the key point. If at any point when you play through the movie, you notice any discomfort or block or resistance to the idea that you can cope, open your eyes. And I'll tell you in a minute what we do when they do that. If you don't hit any blocks, let me know when you've played through the whole video. So if the client closes their eyes and starts working through the video, if and when they open their eyes, which they commonly will, not always, but if they open their eyes, all that is a cue for you to do is just to say, I can handle it, and do another set of fast BLS. And then when you finish the set, you simply just say, close your eyes again, pick up from that same spot, keep playing it through. If there's any further blocks, open your eyes. Say they open their eyes again, you say, repeat the words, I can handle it. It can be in their own mind or it can be out loud. And just notice that, and you do another set. So essentially they're pausing the movie at any point where there is discomfort and opening their eyes, and you're doing another set of fast active bilateral stimulation to desensitize any residual disturbance. And you just keep repeating that until they can get through the whole movie without any disturbance. And once they say they're at the end, I then say to them, okay, could you please now close your eyes again, play it through in its entirety with those words, I can handle it, and go with that. And then they work it through in their own mind's eye, and you play that through and you do those steps over and over if needed, which it often isn't. Often you might just have a couple of little niggles until the client can be the movie can be played without any disturbance. And then once we've done that, closure and reevaluation as per normal. Kate said, I'm sorry, I feel I've missed something. Why would we use the flash forward procedure versus the timeline method? Thank you so much for asking, Kate. It's really important that I'm on the page that everyone's on so that we feel really clear. What I want to just share is that this is really just a way that you can target a particular type of issue. So if you've got a client who on the timeline has identified past targets, you would just be using the standard protocol to target all of those. If the client had residual flash forwards, so particularly when they've come to the present prong, we've done the past targets using the timeline method or any method of target selection. If there's still fears, catastrophic fears, we would just use this procedure to target this type of target. So it's not that this is in lieu of the timeline method. This is not another case conceptualization method. It's just a way of using the standard protocol to target a particular type of issue, which is these catastrophic fears. Kate, can you just share, does that feel clear? Because if it doesn't, I really want to go on that point further, because it feels very important to me that everybody's on the same page here, because otherwise it's not helpful. The last thing I want is to confuse anybody. Bonnie's asked, can we use flash forward early in therapy without processing other memories first? I'll come to that in just a moment. Yeah. Can I just ask if anybody else feels a little unclear, please pop that in the chat box just so that I know, so that I can clarify it again. So just to really be clear, flash forward fits in the present prong in EMDR therapy as a way of targeting any catastrophic fears that the client has. It doesn't replace the methods that we've already discussed today, which are used for identifying past targets in the past prong, and we can use both of them. Kate says the need to flash forward would suggest the timeline procedure had not processed. It's a really interesting point. I mean, essentially, EMDR therapy is a three-pronged approach: past, present, and future. And it's a fascinating point to consider, because the very fact that there are three prongs suggests that the past prong in and of itself, whether we're using a timeline method or a evidence method or any method to identify past targets, it's suggestive that doing the past prong is not always completely sufficient, and that I think it's okay. I mean, it doesn't mean that the adaptive information processing model doesn't stand. The past targets are highly relevant, but I guess it's probably reflective of the fact that clients have often spent so much of their life living in such a manner in the present and in their life to reinforce fears, negative cognitions, things like avoidance, safety behaviors, things like, for example, standing with your back to the wall just routinely. That may be something that people have done for years and years and years. So I'll give you an example. I had a client who I worked with who had some past trauma related to an assault. We processed the assault very effectively, but even once we processed that, when we checked in the present prong whether there was any residual disturbance, that memory was no longer disturbing, but they were feeling like they still in crowded places felt unsettled and was still standing with their back to the wall. And when we explored it further, kind of like when I was talking, I think it was to Honey earlier, about did the past memories need more work, we identified that they didn't really. It was really just that the client had been living in a way habitually that reinforced the old cognition, I'm not safe. So we targeted the standing against the wall, or rather the target was not standing against the wall and having people around them. We targeted that in the present prong, and then we did some future template work, and that helped to clear it. So I think it's a suggestion, or the suggestion really is that the past work often does the heavy lifting, but you do always need to check if there are any residual targets, environmental issues, avoidance, safety behaviours, and indeed any catastrophic fears that still need to be addressed. So let's have a little look. There's a couple of great little comments in here, which is super helpful. So Rosemary said, would you do the whole thing, standard protocol and video check in the one session, or would the video check be the next session? Rosemary, you do the whole thing in a session if time allowed. If time didn't allow, as always, you just close it as a complete session and you do it in a future session. Master said this is very relevant to anxiety because anxiety is about worrying about the future, the what if. So the flash forward is totally relevant in dealing with anxiety. Yeah, I agree. So again, this doesn't replace what we've already been talking about. This just targets something different. So past traumas on a timeline are not the flash forwards that people may be still having. I think they go hand in hand. Kylie said, when we're in the desensitization phase, would you keep it contained to the target image or allow free association to other fears? That would depend, Kylie, on the client. I'd say generally, rule of thumb is allow association if it can be tolerated. And if the client is managing it, I would only start to use more of those restricted protocol techniques to rein it in if I felt like the client was starting to unravel or just numerous fears were coming up and it was becoming unmanageable, or if the client and I had agreed at the start of the session that that's what we were going to do. If we agreed we'd keep it contained, of course I would use the restricted protocol, but commonly I wouldn't, or typically I wouldn't do that. Olivia says, I think I get confused between flash forward and the future prong. The future prong part wasn't well covered in my basic training. Olivia, that's one of my little bugbears, shall we say. I couldn't agree more, and it's something that I feel very passionate about. I'm actually going to go on to talk a little bit more about that today. If you don't feel that I adequately address it, then please at the end ask further questions and we can discuss that as a group, because I couldn't agree more. I don't think the present or the future prong tend to be covered as much in basic training as would be helpful for us. Okay, so when should you use flash forward? So this is an answer to a question that got asked a moment ago. So normally you would use this once you've already done your past targets. So if you think of the past, the present, and the future prongs, once you've done the past using the timeline method, using the evidence method, or using any method of target selection, once you've done that, if any anticipatory anxiety still remains in the present prong, you would then be doing the flash forward if there was any catastrophic fears. Except, as always, there's some exceptions. Someone asked, well, could you do this first rather than going to the past first? And if you come back to my very early slides about principle, not prescription, and not being rigid, the answer is yes. And I'm not trying to confuse you by saying that, but indeed you can. You can start in the past, the present, or the future at any point in any time with a client. So generally, it would make sense theoretically to do it once you've done the past, because remember with the AIP model, the roots of the tree, the past is the root cause of the presenting concern. However, times where you might do this first, so you could start with this before going back. If you can't come up with any past traumatic memories, some clients just don't seem able to be able to come up with anything. Or if you have a client who's highly disturbed or disrupted or impaired by a flash forward, or they may have some reason logistically or just, in their life that means that you simply have to deal with this as a matter of priority. I'll give you a brief example. I had a client who had a flight coming up, an overseas flight. That was long ago, pre-COVID days when we could travel. She was going overseas in 3 weeks, and she essentially came to me and said, look, I just simply can't get on the plane. I'm really concerned I'm going to end up cancelling the trip. I've got a flying phobia. We did some brief history taking because we wanted to get onto it quite soon. And we worked out that really it wasn't about flying, because she'd not had what I mean by that, sorry, was the fear was flying, but the actual issue was not that she'd been in a plane accident or something. It was this feeling of being trapped. And we identified that was very likely linked to a rape experience she had as a teenager. And so we did identify, look, if we had more time right now, and if it wasn't coming up in 3 weeks, it would make sense for us probably to start with that, because I think that is the root issue here. But given she was going on the aeroplane only 3 weeks in the future and was really concerned that she was going to have to cancel the trip, we started with a flash forward, and we got it. I can't recall whether we completely resolved it, because there really was an underlying issue, but we got it good enough that she was able to successfully get on the plane and fly with the aid of some Valium, I remember. But she got on the plane, she flew, she returned from the trip, and then we went back into the past and were able to really clear it properly. But that was an example where it was just relevant and it was sensible to do that. So if you think back to my earlier principles, do what's meaningful and relevant for the client. Some clients may also be quite skeptical about EMDR therapy or don't want to go back into the past, but may feel like they've got, a presentation coming up at work and they're just constantly, freezing when they have to speak in public and they can't bear it. They may be like, well, I don't want to work on my, being bullied as a kid. So you may get buy-in by doing flash forward first, or if you just can't find anything else to target, you can start with this. So I'd love to open up some discussion if anyone would like to share anything about how you might apply this. So even though this is a presentation today on anxiety and phobias, you can apply the flash forward procedure to a range of different things. Anything where there is a fear or a future catastrophized event. So phobias, of course, so social phobia or anxiety might be the fear of something horrible happening if they go to a particular gathering. With obsessive compulsive disorder, fears of being contaminated, illness, anxiety disorder, so fear of dying or death, PTSD, so future focused catastrophes around being raped again, for example, anorexia nervosa, what's going to happen? I'll get fat or something horrible will happen if I eat. Panic disorder, of course, the fear of a panic attack. Does anybody have any other ideas or examples of where you've used this with your clients? HSC exams, says Michelle, very, very relevant. Even if you haven't used it before, I'd be interested to think about whether you've got any clients at the moment for whom this might be helpful. Rosemary, a client with a fear of dying when having wisdom teeth extracted. Yeah, could be very relevant. Medical procedures, definitely. Things like clients who have had birth trauma, if there's a fear of it happening the next time. So if they're pregnant, for example, and you're wanting to do a flash forward of the upcoming birth of their baby, vaccination again. Carolyn asked, how do you work with panic disorder potentially related to a medical condition, as in experience of physiological disturbance related to recent significant surgery? I'm not sure that I would change my approach, Carolyn. If you'd like to unmute yourself and speak, you could certainly give me more context to ask questions. Beyond that, I'm not entirely sure, just from reading what you've written, that I would do things differently to what I've presented, but you're most welcome to speak.
Hi, Caroline. Can you see me?
Sure can. Go for it.
So I have a client who had significant removal of her bowel. So eating potentially has an impact on her physiological changes. So she's been having a lot of panic attacks since being released from hospital. So do you suggest still doing the same thing, or she's quite reliant on endone, Valium to be able to leave the house?
Yeah. Oh, look, I think that's such a complex one, isn't it? Because there are obviously very, very real physical issues at hand. I had a client, same situation, but a client who had part of her bowel removed and was having ongoing bowel incontinence and was highly distressed at the thought of soiling herself, to the point that she was essentially agoraphobic. Look, when it comes to EMDR therapy, Carolyn, I would approach it in the same way, but I would be using EMDR in conjunction with other therapy approaches to support a client with that sort of thing.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. Kerry said, can you use it for a client who's anxious that a depressed daughter might suicide? Yes, you could. Yeah, you could. Yeah. Bonnie's asked, is the only interweave for blocks I can handle it? No, you could use any interweave. You use your standard clinical judgment when you're doing any EMDR desensitization. You use any interweave that seems to be clinically relevant at the time. It could be drawing on, a resource figure. It could be thinking about what supports the person has in place, reminding them of times that they've coped before. There's a whole range of things you could draw on there. Julie says, I intend to use it in a coming session with a client to handle the stress of COVID lockdown, catastrophic fears associated with unintentionally breaching restrictions. Yep, I think this is very topical and relevant for a lot of our clients at this time. Thanks, Julie. Does anybody have any other questions? I see Angela's just popped one in the chat box, which I'll address in a moment, but otherwise, please feel free to use the raised hand feature or pop things in the chat box. Angela says, I have a question. Would they need to still do behavioural experiments to strengthen adaptive information and not rely on safety behaviours? Angela, you're always one step ahead of me, which is really, it makes me smile because it means you and I are on the same page. The answer's sometimes yes, and we'll talk about that in the training in the minutes to come. Great question. Does anybody have any other questions? Connie says, I'd like to use with the young mum who's fearful of her baby dying, not sure what an interweave would be. My encouragement, Honey, and I don't mean to in any way suggest that it's easy, is that rather than preparing interweaves ahead of time or even needing to know what they would be, is probably really just to work organically with what's coming up for the client at the time. I think interweaves is something that we can't really necessarily predict. I think it's often about intuition in the moment, I suppose. If anybody does have any ideas of any particular interweaves, you're welcome to pop them in the chat box. But ultimately, I think it's it's about what feels relevant in that moment, and trusting the process as well. Olivia says that's suitable to use for both unrealistic and potentially realistic fears. Look, that's a really good question. It was designed more for irrational, catastrophic fears. Do you feel comfortable, Olivia, to either write or to speak, to share what you mean by realistic? What's an example?
Something that's, I guess, potentially unlikely, but potentially something that could happen, like not, I don't know, like thinking back to somebody who had a high risk surgery coming up or something like that, where there was a reasonable chance or some evidence to suggest that, it wasn't, completely unrealistic, that there might be a bad event, but they just wanted to be able to cope better with it regardless.
Look, I think you could. I think you could use it. I mean, you've obviously got to use your judgment in every situation. I think if something is highly likely to happen to the extent that we need to be preparing a client for it, you may take a different approach. But if it's something that possibly could happen but is unlikely, then sure, I would certainly apply it. Because as you just very rightly said, often it's about the person's capacity to cope, even in the unlikely event that it actually happened. Because you're right. I mean, a lot of fears that people have are not completely out of the realm of possibility. In fact, a lot of them are possible things, aren't they? Unlikely usually, but yeah, so I think it would have relevance potentially. Thanks, Olivia. Does anybody have any other questions or comments? Okay, we'll have another stretch now. So just take a moment. I'm just going to pour myself a little bit more water. Have yourself a little bit of a stretch and get yourself a drink as well. We're on the home stretch now, everyone. You're doing so well. I can appreciate a lot of us are probably very zoomed out, so I'm so grateful to have you all here. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about now is about phobia and panic protocols. And before we get into these, with a smile, I just really want to say I'm not trying to confuse anybody here. This is standard protocol, just really wearing a different jacket ultimately. It's really just kind of the order in which you target things and what you do target. Can I just invite anyone who's not muted to mute yourself now, please? I can hear a little bit of background noise. Thank you. So when I share with you now, and I'm just going to share quite briefly the phobia and the panic protocols, really they are not that different at all. It's simply just standard protocol, but just what you might target, because really most protocols that are developed for different clinical presentations are the standard protocol. And it's actually quite reassuring, because otherwise I think we can lose our marbles thinking that we have to learn 100 different ways. It's simply just kind of what you might target and how you might approach things. So this phobia protocol that I'm going to mention to you now more or less cuts across the past, the present, and the future prongs. So if you were wanting to target phobias and you wanted to approach it as Shapiro herself suggested, I'm just sharing this because this is what Shapiro developed in her early books. What we would start with is, of course, resourcing, as we've previously discussed, things like breathing, relaxation, self-soothing. In terms of targeting and reprocessing the past, basically, in this case, just to be really clear, if you were going to use this as a standalone protocol, you wouldn't use the timeline method or the evidence method. You just use this and you keep it quite contained. This would be perhaps for a simple phobia or something. So really, it's not that it's better, worse, it's just another way you could do it. So rather than approaching the target sequencing, as I've discussed previously today, this is just another option you could consider. Using the standard protocol, you would start with any events that predated the onset of the phobia that seemed to have similar feelings and sensations. Then you'd go with the first, the worst, and the most recent time that the person experienced the fear. So rather than, I suppose, with the timeline method or the evidence method, where it's a little bit less clear or there's multiple different targets, I mean, it's a very similar principle in essence to the timeline method. But if you wanted to use this as a standalone protocol, you just start with anything that predated that feels relevant, first, worst, most recent, then move on to the present triggers. And you could certainly use the flash forward procedure in here if you wanted to as well, if you wanted to combine the phobia protocol with the flash forward procedure. Remember, that comes in under the present triggers. And then with a future template, and this really is very similar to flash forward anyway, we would create an imaginal resource of basically how the person would like to cope with the phobia and run a video of that, make sure there's no discomfort. And as Ange was asking about before, we would want to do some in vivo exposure and behavior experiments. We'll talk about that in a little bit of time to come. So just to be really clear, the reason I'm sharing this is not to replace what we've already talked about. It's just to share that this is something that Shapiro herself, who developed EMDR therapy, suggested you might try for phobias. This was developed before the flash forward procedure was even developed. But as you can see, there are a range of different similarities. If anybody is unclear, feel free to pop that in the chat box. And Hurst, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Hurst and Adjong have also made some suggestions about a panic disorder protocol. And again, it's just the same standard protocol, but in terms of the targets that you would be addressing, rather than it being with the phobias, the early onset and the first, etc., it's the first panic attack, the worst panic attack, a recent panic attack, and then any past trauma. So this is just another way that you can approach it. I think if all the different options that I've presented to you today feel overwhelming for you, what I would suggest is that you try past first using either timeline or evidence proof memory method, and then the flash forward procedure, and then installing a future template. And we're going to talk about a future template. The panic disorder protocol and the phobia protocol are just a couple of other sort of examples of how you can approach this if you would like. I just want to give everyone a really thorough overview of the literature on this particular topic. Julia says, I've read that the body scan is not done until all targets are processed and after the future template. Have I read this correctly? I don't think so. The body scan is for a single target, or for phobia particularly. That's a good question. I haven't personally read that, but if you've read that, then I stand corrected. It may be that you can get a clear body scan on a specific target, so a phobia in this case, and that's clear, but that you don't have an overall clear body scan until you've addressed all targets. I'm not entirely sure. If you wanted to say anything further about that, you're very welcome to do so. Generally, though, the body scan is a part of addressing a single target. And once we've got a clear body scan, then that target is considered to be tied up. One thing that I will just say is that the phobia and the panic disorder protocols do have a slightly different suggestion about how you might do a target check. So you don't have to do this, but it is just a very slight modification on the standard protocol. The suggestion really is that it's about trying to explicitly identify what remaining aspect of the target needs to be addressed. So when you do your target check, so going back to target, and you do a SUDS check 0 to 10, if it's 1 or higher, so there's some residual disturbance, there's just some phrasing there that has been suggested, particularly by Hurston and De Jong with the panic disorder protocol, around how you can really get to the bottom of the residual disturbance. So look at the incident as it's now stored in your head, what aspect of it's most disturbing. So really narrowing down, rather than just saying, you know, oh, it's a 1 or it's a 2, just notice that, really honing in. And in fact, you could use this with any target check if you want to, but this is something that's slightly unique to these particular protocols. So focusing on what's residual, what you can see, and then concentrate on that and go with that. So just a reminder, we've got the past, the present, and the future. And so all of these approaches that I've been talking to you about today, they're really just different ways that you might like to consider approaching treating anxiety and phobias. They're not one replacing the other. You can actually consider different options or combine even, as I said, one of those target selection methods, the timeline method and the or the evidence proof method, say with the flash forward procedure. What we're always wanting to consider is that there are 3 time periods and not neglecting any of those. And so, as has already been mentioned by a couple of people today, you know, this idea about the present and the future prong is not emphasized as much, in my opinion, in trainings in EMDR therapy as I think it needs to be. And so, as I described earlier, a common error, I think, is that people tend to do a lot of the past stuff. So in this case, let's say we used the timeline method to process all the past targets. The client may then say they feel better and we feel really good, off they go. But we haven't actually checked, are there any residual triggers in the present, which can include flash forwards, so currently held future fears, or other present triggers, maybe things like sexual intimacy, being in a car, the guy with the back to the wall, things like certain foods, being alone, a particular time of day. There can be a range of different triggers. And if we haven't also then done the installing of a positive cognition, a future template, which I'm about to share with you a little more about, then we're not actually doing a full, complete treatment in EMDR therapy. And there is more likelihood of the client relapsing or not having the full benefit of the therapy sustained over time. So the past is what we think of the most, and that's where we have past trauma, any adverse experiences, and any of the targets that we've identified in those 2 methods that I mentioned earlier, timeline or cognitive evidence proof. What we're now talking about in the present prong, in addition to flash forwards, which is where De Jong and Logie suggest the flash forward procedure sits. So even though there are fears about the future, and as I said personally, I would have thought it made more sense to be in the future prong, but I'm teaching you how it's taught by them, is that it's currently held, so therefore it's a present trigger. Other examples that we can use to target with the standard protocol can be a range of different present triggers like what I've got on the screen. So just to be really clear, the present triggers can be both just day-to-day scenarios or these flash forwards, so the future catastrophic fears. So where you would, if you were to target a present trigger using the standard protocol of like being in a crowded place or being on public transport, the client may not have a future sort of catastrophic, irrational image that goes with it. It may just be when they're on a tram, they feel anxious. So the way you would target that would be just standard protocol. Once you've done the past, usually we'd move on to the present, and it would be just what's the image that represents being on the tram, feeling unsettled. It might be them standing there holding the bar, feeling really nervous, heart pounding and feeling really overwhelmed. What's a negative cognition? I have no control. Emotion, suds, body sensation, once you've done the positive cognition, of course, and then reprocessing it with standard protocol. Where you'd use the flash forward in the present prong would be if there's the catastrophic future focused fears, as well as just the day-to-day anxiety and disturbance that's triggered in the present. Feel free to pop into the chat box if there are any present triggers that your clients have experienced that you've targeted in EMDR. If anybody has any questions about the present prong, feel free to ask those now. Okay. Showering, yes, Michelle's got one there that I've had. Certainly clients have found that showering is indeed a very, very common one. So the target would be essentially, if it's linked to a memory and you haven't reprocessed the memory of something having happened, then certainly you could use the past prong to reprocess that. But in the present prong, it could be the image of being in the shower and what's so horrible about that, and then the negative cognition, and then you process it as per normal. Yeah, standard protocol. So then in the future template, this is the future prong in EMDR therapy. This is really akin to imaginal rehearsal, resourcing. The way I explain it to clients, it's a bit like if you imagine you have an athlete who has the Olympics coming up, and their sports psychologist or whatever work they're doing involves them imagining performing their craft, whatever sport it is, over and over again, and being able to visualize performing well, being able to really master it, being able to draw on their calm, their poise, use nervousness to their best capacity, and being able to really visualize coping beautifully. That's what a future template is. And so in EMDR, the other way to think of it is it's resourcing for the future. So it's usually done once we've targeted past, once we've done present, and now we're wanting to make sure the client is really equipped to cope into the future and to be able to imagine themselves coping well and to indeed be able to live well into the future. So it involves some imaginal rehearsal, as I said, and here's a lovely little phrase that you could consider using with your clients. So imagine yourself coping in that situation with this positive belief that I can handle it, a feeling of calm, a feeling of confidence. And now imagine that I'm stepping into that situation now. What's that feel like? And essentially, once we've got the client to visualize that, usually with their eyes closed, we ask, what are you noticing? If the client does have any disturbance, you can do rapid sets of BLS to clear any blocks. But if there are no blocks, and we're essentially wanting just to strengthen this as a lovely resource for the client, which is not dissimilar to Calm Place, to any resource development installation, you would get them to imagine the scene, coping really well, where they feel that warmth and whatever positive feeling it is in their body, and do a short, slow set. So either eye movements, or it may be, as I said earlier, if their eyes are closed and they prefer to do some slow, gentle tapping, then that can often work well. And just a reminder about bilateral stimulation, fast whenever we're desensitizing, including if there's a block in the future template, and slow is when we're wanting to strengthen and resource. So with the future template, once it's sort of ready and the client's got no longer has any disturbance and it feels really positive, we're more or less resourcing them, just like we do in phase 2 with calm, safe place and other things. I just wanted to mention, and time's getting away from me, so I can't speak about this at too much length, but I've had the pleasure of meeting Ad de Jong and doing a session with Ad de Jong. He came to Melbourne a number of years ago, and I was on the organising committee for that conference when he spoke for a number of days about EMDR and anxiety disorders, and I've also had the pleasure of meeting him overseas as well. And he talked about 2 things that were really my main takeaways from him, and I just wanted to mention them to you as just a bit of a kind of comment as I start to wrap up for today. He suggested that it's really important with anxiety disorders, particularly because that's his bread and butter, to make sure you really activate the target and that you really tax the working memory. So what he means by taxing the working memory is rather than it just being eye movements that are just rather, slow, and this is when you're desensitizing, that don't really do a lot. We're really wanting essentially to compete with that memory with as much stimulation as possible. And so the working memory theory is actually the most compelling evidence now for why EMDR therapy works. You have a memory or an issue that you're bringing from long-term memory into short-term, or otherwise known as working memory, simultaneously engaging in a very taxing activity that more or less competes with the memory, and the brain's capacity to hold the memory vividly is diminished because the brain has a limited or a finite capacity in working memory. And so as a result, the memory reduces in vividness because it's being competed with, and that then leads to the reduction in the emotional disturbance, and then thinking starts to change. And so I just wanted to remind everybody about how important these things are. We were talking before about the CPAP machine and how you could even get the client to bring that into session. I'm not suggesting you do that with every client, but if you've got a client who has a phobia and in session they're actually really struggling to really connect with the fear because the thing's not here, you could get them to watch a YouTube clip of the feared scenario. You could get them to play a song that really triggers them. You could get them to look at an email on their phone from their boss who's triggering. And please note, all of this would be, of course, with the client's informed consent. You're only doing it if clinically appropriate and if the client's in agreement. So we really want to tax the memory because that's going to mean that we can process it much more effectively. Activate the memory, and then we want to tax the memory as much as possible. So essentially, in essence, taxing the memory means that eye movements need to be as fast as the eyes can comfortably follow. And if it's getting blocked at any point, I would encourage you to add in some extra layers of taxation. So while the client's following with their eyes, they could even start tapping their head and rubbing their belly, or they could hum a song out loud, or they could in their head count 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 while they're following, or they could do a complex pattern on their knees at the same time. So these are some exciting lessons that are coming out of the latest research, particularly in EMDR 2.0, which Ad de Jong is very well known for these days. And as we start to wind up for today, I just wanted to mention, as I've said earlier, the importance of integrating EMDR therapy with other approaches. EMDR therapy, in my opinion, doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's not just as simple as just reprocessing past traumas or indeed even present triggers and installing a future template. It's really about the client's life changing, the client's day-to-day interactions with others and behavior and way of existing in the world that needs to change. And often that will organically happen by virtue of the fact that, if you think about the AIP model, the roots of the tree, by virtue of the fact that you've targeted the right things, often it will just naturally change. Their way of existing and interacting and being will change. But in some cases, it won't, just because of habitual behavior or safety behavior. And absolutely, in those cases, we do need to be integrating EMDR therapy with exposure work, behavior experiments, skills training, committed action that's linked to the person's values. So I think it's really, really important to remember that EMDR therapy can be beautifully integrated with other approaches, and indeed it is necessary to do so. So what other approaches have you found helpful? Feel free, we've only got 5 minutes, or feel free if you'd like to say anything just as we start to wrap up. You can raise your hand, you can write anything in the chat box. What are we integrating EMDR therapy with? That's what people are thinking. Michelle's popped in the chat box. I've found that when the memory is fully activated and taxing the working memory, phase 4, which is desensitization, works much quicker in session. Yeah. What do we got here? ACT, art therapy, somatic experiencing, resource therapy, ACT, compassion focused therapy, exposure therapy. Beautiful. Yep. I think these things are really, really important to consider. So as we start to wrap up for today, does anybody have any questions? I particularly wanted to check whether there were any confusing points, because I know I did share a number of different options and different approaches. Olivia said, can you please explain how a disturbance arising with a present target, with the disturbance presumably involving some past experience, is different to using a current or recent trigger situation to identify past targets? E.g. raised voices as a present target. Presumably this is going to be disturbing because of a past negative experience. I just want to read that again, sorry. Look, I think you're right, Olivia, that they are intricately linked. I suppose generally you would start with the past negative experience and process that. And then if there was any residual triggering when the person, heard a raised voice, for example, then you could target that as a present trigger. For example, when you hear your child scream or you hear your partner raise his voice, what's the image that goes with that? It might be your partner's face, and what's the negative cognition, and you can process it. So certainly you could do it that way. But remember, as I said earlier, you can start at any point in the 3 prongs as well. If I haven't addressed that, Olivia, please do speak up. I'm not 100% sure that I've quite understood, so please say more if you need me to. All of this is just so interconnected. There's different ways to do it, and that's really what I meant earlier on when I said at the very beginning of my presentation, there is no right answer. There's no perfect starting point. You can start with past, then do present, then do future. You could have a client who doesn't want to do the past, but is really fixated and concerned about a present trigger and a flash forward, and we do that first. You may have some clients who really need to be resourced and they've got an upcoming situation, so you start with a future template and then work your way back. It's about principles, not prescription. These are just different options for you to consider. Any other questions? Kylie's asked, just want to clarify, when working on present triggers, do we look at the catastrophic fear attached or just the image of that fear with the negative cognition? That's a really great question. The answer is both. So both are incorporated within that present prong. So it could be either, depending on the situation. So if you've got a client, for example, who the trigger is being in a shower, you would certainly check, is there some sort of catastrophic aspect? It may be that they're terrified that when they're in the shower, someone's going to come into the house because they're unawares, because the water's running and that it's loud and they can't hear, in which case flash forward would make more sense. If it's just that being in the shower, the feeling of the water or their naked body or whatever it is triggering in and of itself, then you would just use the standard protocol. So the flash forward aspect only applies if there naturally is a catastrophic element, and there will be for some present triggers and not for others. My pleasure. Okay. Here's a few little references for you, so feel free to check out any of these. In the resources that I've sent you, I've given you that article on that 2-method approach. I've also given you the flash forward procedure with the phobia and the panic protocol. I haven't given you anything extra because there really is nothing extra that I want to confuse us with, just what's on those slides there. So I hope that those are helpful for you. I just wanted to let you know that my upcoming event, my next event, is troubleshooting in EMDR therapy. This is going to be a goodie, and I'm really looking forward to this one. This one's coming up in October, on the 23rd of October. Registration is now open via my website, carolineburrows.com.au. So please jump online if you'd like to register for that one. I do hope that that's an interesting topic for you. I also just wanted to mention that I do have my on-demand training. So all of the trainings that I deliver live, obviously you get the recording for lifetime access, but people can purchase after the event. So if anyone's interested in today's event that hasn't been able to come along, they'll be able to purchase it on my website in the next week or so. And all of my past trainings are available for on-demand purchase on my website as well. I also just wanted to mention that twice a month I run EMDR online group case consultation sessions, and they're a fantastic opportunity to connect with other like-minded therapists, to learn from each other and to work with me. My one-to-one consultation sessions are pretty heavily booked up at the moment, but working with me in a small group context is available and something that I would be delighted to offer you if you'd be interested. So you can jump also on my website and have a look if there are any dates that suit you, or if you'd like to register for any of those. Michelle's saying she highly recommends the group sessions. Thanks so much, Michelle. It's been lovely to have you in some of those. So if anyone, just as we finish up, would like to share with me, I would love your ideas. This is the last thing I'm going to ask before we say farewell. In the chat box or just out loud, can anyone share, are there any topics that you would like me to present on next year? Because I am getting busy and getting ready. I'm going to be rolling out basic EMDR training next year, level 1, level 2, which I'm just absolutely delighted to be doing. But in terms of these webinars that are for people that have done basic training, anything that you guys are interested in, please pop them in there or speak out loud now and let me know. I would be absolutely delighted to get your feedback and your ideas on what you'd find interesting and would like me to present on. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you so very much for your time today. It's been absolutely a pleasure as always. I do hope that it's been helpful. If anyone has any questions that are still outstanding, I'll be really keen to support you with that. So we'll close the PowerPoint presentation in a moment and just come back together. And if there are any burning questions, I'm happy to hang on the line for a few extra minutes and certainly answer those. Thanks so much for the ideas that everybody is putting in the chat box there. So it's lovely to see you all again, those of us who are still here, which is most of us. Does anybody have any burning questions before we finish up for today? Okay. Well, thank you to everybody who's writing lovely feedback in the chat box. I really appreciate that. Well, we'll leave it there for today then. Go well, everybody, particularly those who are in lockdown at the moment. I send my warmest wishes to you, and I do hope that you all keep safe and well, and I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. I'll be sending you the recording from this training in the next 3 days, and so you'll have access to that lifetime access, and obviously you've already received the slides and resources, but I'll resend those as well. So thank you so very much for your great participation today. I wish you all the best. Bye for now.